Hello and very warm welcome to everyone from all around the world. Here we are today, and I need to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. You are joining us all the way from Fiji to the west coast of the USA, and welcome, very warm welcome from all of us here in Brussels. My name is Maya, and I will be your host for today. But today we don't only have geographical, but also professional diversity. Attendees, you people are coming from different backgrounds. You are decision makers, you are school teachers, you are journalists, faith leaders, school administrators, education experts, humanitarian and development professionals, and policy experts. So welcome, all of you. And before we dig deeper into debates about how to make education a reality for every child here in the world, I have a question for you. And the question is, how would you describe your school experience? Please use Slido and use just one word. Use one word to express your feelings about your schooling time, whether in primary or secondary school. So what were your experience with the school? Okay, so let's see. How did you experience your education time? Can I see your responses?
Excuse me, where do we respond?
So you go to the Slido, you take the phone, you scan the QR code, and then you can just type one word. So you type one word, and then we can see what was your school experience. Okay, it was okay. Oh, great! It was great. It was carefree. Okay, so it was very positive. Okay, good. It was good. It was eventful. We had grades. Okay, great. Okay, so I can see that you had very positive experience with your school. Okay, we can see positive, really positive experience with your education. Okay, so many good memories, and sadly we have children who cannot create these memories and didn't have opportunity to create them. Hundreds and millions of children all around the world are without access to education. We are here today in this virtual space because we cannot accept that so many children in 21st century are denied a fundamental human right, which is the right to learn and develop. As a society, we know how to fly to the moon and even further on Mars. But somehow we don't know how to teach every child to read, write, and do the basic math. Seventh-day Adventist Church and its humanitarian arm, ADRA, joined forces and started a global campaign to advocate for every child to be in school. So far, we have 1.3 million advocates for education. Yes, we can. We cannot do it alone. We need a global movement for inclusive and quality education spiced with concrete support where required. So we are here today to explore solutions. I'm inviting every one of you to our ideas room. Put your thoughts, ideas, good practices there. Doing our education link to the idea room on the Slido where you can use it all the time. Here with me in the opening session are four very special people: Rafat Kamal, Victor Negrescu, Kirsten Larsen-Moos, and Gershon Nimbocker. Thank you all for joining. First speaker is Mr. Rafat Kamal. If we say that dedicated UN workers have a blood in the color of blue color, then I can say that Mr. Rafat's blood runs green. When I first met him, he told me that once you start working for ADRA, your
I'm afraid we might have lost Maya's sound. We have a little technical hiccup. Maya, if you're with us.
Yes, I'm back. Yes, I'm back.
Wonderful.
Okay, so I'm inviting Mr. Rafat Kamal to give us his view how we can accelerate education for every child. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. I wish to add a word of welcome on behalf of the ADRA Europe board, representing 30 offices, and by extension, the family of the ADRA World Network. As already been mentioned by Maya, the summit is building on the ADRA Network Advocacy Campaign that was agreed at the annual gathering in Jordan, as some of you might remember, on 25th February 2019. And in a nutshell, the objective is to speak up for out-of-school children by empowering girls, refugees, and children with disabilities. Every child, everywhere, in school, which is the slogan of this advocacy campaign. And it's a global Adventist church and ADRA-led movement to ensure that every child, everywhere, attends school and completes their education so they can fulfill their God-given potential. The preferred future for this campaign is that no child should ever be denied an education, not because of where they live, not because their government is failing to provide adequate and free education, not because their family is poor, not because of conflict and displacement, not because of their gender, ethnicity, or disability. Every child, everywhere, has a right to attend school and get an education. We as a world community, all of us represented here on the screen, have a responsibility to invest early in education and invest in learning for all, since foundational skills acquired early in childhood make possible a lifetime of learning. Without question, friends, without question, education is transformative, and it is the best way to develop people and communities. So this advocacy campaign to speak up for out-of-school children is aimed at some of the most marginalized people groups: girls, refugees, and children with disabilities. Here are some statistics which I guess you are familiar with. Despite the good progress made over the past centuries, sadly, and on a global scale, 262 million children, adolescents, and youth are currently denied this right. 1 in 5 children worldwide are out of school. Around 90% of children with disabilities in the developing world are not in school. Refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. On this last point, regarding refugee children, I experienced this firsthand. I was internally and internationally displaced by civil war for 8 years. 18 of my relatives were killed. I have 2 war injuries, and our house was hit twice by rockets and once burned down. But the scar that I still have with me today is a disruption to my education for 5 long years. See, lack of education and disruption in education can impact lives negatively. Disadvantages linger. Poverty continues. Scars remain for a long time. Without doubt, some of the most meaningful development projects that I was involved in my professional life were education-centered. For example, adult literacy, school building, income generation training, health training, civil society development, just to list a few, were transformative in every sense of the word. And notice these 3 words: reversing the destinies of those impacted. With 262 million children out of school, what is at stake is not just 260 million futures, but 262 million generations of children who can be born healthier, raised in a household that supports their education, and ultimately have the opportunity to live a better life than their parents, free from extreme poverty, forced marriage, exploitation, or undignified labor. With more than 21 million members globally, operating the second largest private education system in the world, the Adventist Church, with its 8,800 schools in collaboration with ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, and hundreds of governmental and non-governmental and grassroots partners, have not only a unique opportunity, but also a moral responsibility to ensure that every child everywhere has the opportunity to attend school and get a quality education. It is a human right and is a recognition of the value and potential of each individual child. Every child is a child of God, precious in his sight, and deserves the opportunity to live a life of dignity and purpose, free from exploitation and the shackles of poverty. In conclusion, accelerating access to education for all children must be designed and implemented with urgency as a disruptive approach to status quo, and should be child-centric to reverse their destinies. Friends, to reverse their destinies. So therefore, I appeal to you to reverse their destinies and continue to speak up for out-of-school children by empowering girls, refugees, and children with disabilities. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Rafat Kamal. I was cut off a little bit earlier, so I didn't properly introduce Rafat Kamal. He started his professional career as a teacher and school administrator, and later on he was an ADRA leader in Southern Asia and United Kingdom. And for the last 14 years, Mr. Rafat Kamal serves as a faith leader in Europe. He is currently president of the Trans-European Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and also is the board chair of ADRA Europe. Thank you very much for your words of wisdom. And here I would like to express a warm welcome to Victor Negrescu. Mr. Negrescu, I hope you don't mind if I say that you are one of us. You are connected to education, to humanitarian and to development work through your PhD, your studies, your research, your daily work as a professor, lecturer, and member of the European Parliament. Mr. Negrescu, you are a member of the European Parliament and also vice chair of the CULT Committee. CULT Committee is also in charge of education. And on the behalf of the CULT Committee, Mr. Negrescu is the rapporteur for the European Parliament on shaping the digital education policy. He passionately advocates for the allocation of European funding for quality and inclusive education. Thank you so much. We are here and we are eager to hear what is European Union doing for inclusion and equity in education. The room is yours.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm happy to speak today about education and what the European Union is doing in this regard. I will start by saying that, of course, indeed, it is important, of course, to understand that in order, of course, to make sure that every child gets access to education, it's important to know that we need, again, to properly address this issue at global level, and the European Union can play and should play a more active role in this regard by understanding, of course, that, and you said that, of course, in the previous interventions, no child should be left behind. And when I say that, of course, I refer to the fact that education is linked to our future, the future of our societies, to the future of each individual person. And of course, education offers opportunities to all of those that have access, of course, to the means to prepare themselves for the upcoming challenges. And in this regard, of course, the current pandemic has shown us that we are facing common global challenges linked to education. Also because, of course, we had to move to these digital forms of education, but also because, of course, we have in front of us all these new transformations linked to digital transformation, linked to the green transformation, linked with the need, of course, for understanding ourselves, but also to see what we can do better together in the future. So at European level, of course, we manage at the level of the European Parliament, but also the level of all European institutions, to raise the profile of education in the EU decision-making profile. So first of all, we have launched a digital education action plan showing how member states can tackle the challenges raised by this digital transformation. We speak about the need of having common standards. We speak about the need of not leaving any child behind. We speak about the need of developing adequate infrastructure in order to make sure that all children in Europe, but also in the world, have access, again, to the technologies, enabling them to get access to education even during lockdown periods. Also, we speak about proper facilities, so improving the schools, developing, again, the technologies that are adapted for schools. We speak also about making sure that we are developing, of course, the right methods in order to involve children in the educational process, in order to make sure that, of course, we raise also the quality of education, while in the same time keeping the important role that professors, schools, educators have in the preparation of the upcoming generation. And this is, I think, one of the key issues. In the same time, of course, at European level, we work intensively in building a European education area. So what we are trying to do at European level is to basically bring together the added value that each member state has in order, of course, to make sure that we are recognizing diplomas, we are recognizing the different skills, make sure that we are moving in the same direction, because there are huge inequalities, again, in Europe between member states. So, of course, in terms of quality, in terms of access, in terms, of course, the infrastructure that is available. In the same time, of course, we recognize that this has been addressed also in my report, that the European Union has a global responsibility to come up with initiatives and allocate adequate resources, financial resources, to tackle the issue of access to education and also access to quality education. So the European Union, through its international programs, has to be more active towards these important issues. First of all, is to work together with different entities, with different organizations that are tackling this issue, use the know-how that NGO structures and cultural groups have when tackling this issue of access to education. And in the same time, why not raise the profile of education at global level by coming up with new initiatives that are really trying to identify proper solutions to the issues that we face at global level. Because unfortunately, we speak about education for many years already. And we speak about the need to make sure that everyone should have access to education. But in the same time, some steps have been made, but not enough. And of course, we need to accelerate. And I like that in the name of the panel today, that we need to accelerate what we are doing for education. And of course, we need to use the existing know-how to learn from the mistakes that we have done, while in the same time really moving forward at a faster pace. Because, you know, when a child is not attending school, that child's future that child's potential is not going to be fulfilled. And of course, if we lose one child, we already lost too much. But imagine that we are losing every year thousands, even we can speak about hundreds of thousands of children or people that do not have access, not only young people, but those people of different ages that do not have access to education. And basically due to that, we are losing a lot of what we could do better at global level. So of course, we are tackling this issue in the humanitarian aid programs and development assistance programs. The issue of education has been highlighted. Also, due to the pressure exercised by the European Parliament, we are going to continue doing that, raising the profile of education, while at the same time showing what can be done concretely in this regard in order to tackle these important issues. In the same time, at European level, I'm one of the active promoters. I have been the initiator of an important idea. You know very well, maybe those of you that know more about Europe, that we have develop in Europe a relaunch plan, a plan designed to relaunch Europe after this crisis. And we allocated for that 750 billion euros. And I'm campaigning, and I have the support of many of my colleagues in the European Parliament and of many NGOs, to allocate at least 10% of the recovery and resilience facilities for education. So we managed to introduce that in a policy recommendation made by the European Parliament. We have convinced already a couple of governments to introduce that. We are still campaigning, but in the same time, we want to make sure that we do the same also when we refer to the global intervention of the European Union, that we allocate a lot for education, at least 10% in what we try to achieve in terms of global relaunch after the current pandemic. So, of course, in order to do that, we need the support of all engaged groups willing to support education. And of course, we are campaigning actively for that. So these are basically some of the issues that are of important concern for us in the European Parliament with regards to education. And what I want to point out at the end of my intervention is that it is clear that we are facing important global challenges today and certainly in the years to come. I referred already to the digital transformation. I'm referring to the green challenge. I'm referring to the medical crisis. And of course, there will be a lot of challenges in front of us. And of course, in order to face those challenges, we need to understand that we need to provide a global answer. And this is not easy, to be very frank. Politicians, even like myself, we are responsible, first of all, in front of the people that elect us. So sometimes we tend to ignore, or we don't allocate enough importance to this global dimension. So this is why I believe decision makers should take this responsibility in explaining to people from developed nations, but also from developing countries, that we are in all of this together. And we need to tackle those challenges together. And one of the common issue, or the common denominator of all of those challenges, is education. If we want to achieve and face the digital transformation, we need trained and skilled people, and we need people that know digital skills. If we want to provide a positive answer to the green challenges, we need clean education. We need to teach people how to take care of their environment, how to take care of their community, how to be involved together with their friends, with their families in this green transformation, while at the same time, of course, working together with the most important entities influencing the process. Also, if we want to face the medical challenge, the medical crisis, we also need, of course, to fully understand it. And in the same time, we acknowledge that we need to do more on that. So, of course, education, is the common point in all of that. So if we understand that, the starting point in everything that we are doing in our own communities, in our own countries, in the world, should be education, and I'm actively campaigning for that. So this is why I'm really happy that I was invited for this conference today, and I was really happy to speak to all of you about why I share this point of view that every child everywhere should be in school. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you that we know that we have people on every side of society who advocates for this important issue. And here we are already with our third speaker this afternoon here in Brussels. She's Kirsten Lauritsen-Muth, and she's Chief Executive Officer for Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. Welcome, Kirsten. Her areas of expertise include social and behavior change, leadership development, gender equality. We are very happy that you are with us today. It is a special honor to have you with us. Please speak to us. The room is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to ADRA for the invitation and for organizing this event. Your report is timely given the current conversations on financing reforms that are crucial to achieving inclusive education. It's good to see faith perspectives within these conversations, such as the Jubilee Network and debt relief. We know that COVID has increased marginalization and inequalities. Any work we do in any sector must address intersectional vulnerabilities by considering how racial, economic, sex-based, gender-based, and other forms of oppression are linked, and ensure that access to education takes these into account in ways that not only increase access, but also educate our children to create a new future. We also need to remember the historic negative impacts of education, which have harmed and marginalized those living with these intersectional identities. In the words of Janine Bowen, education is a powerful tool. You can either use it to empower or to colonize. It can be used to ignite a movement or to placate a people. Education approaches are central to advancing social goals and contributing to cohesive societies that minimize disparities and support relationships and trust across diverse groups. Here, I would pose some questions. How can education offer paths that raise self and other awareness and reduce bias and stereotypes? How will we increase capabilities in collaboration and conflict resolution? How will we enable a greater sense of belonging and community in ways that reduce bullying and violence? How can education improve well-being and opportunities for everyone, regardless of their identities? And how will we support the most vulnerable students and their families through developing inclusive and caring environments? There is a vicious cycle between education, inequality, and violent conflict. Inequality increases the likelihood of conflict, and conflict is associated in turn with the loss of schooling and education inequality. According to UNICEF, by 2030, more than 80% of the world's poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. We know that schools, teachers, and students are often targets of violence, including gender-based violence. Climate change is only going to increase these pressures and associated impacts on children's learning and well-being. Education is part of a learning ecosystem. We learn in and out of school through what we are taught and our lived experiences. Faith values are part of this ecosystem. Historically, education has been rooted in faith, and this is common among all faith groups. Currently, children around the world often learn from both secular state and religious educational frameworks. We've also seen faith-inspired education initiatives to close the gaps from COVID school closures and isolation, including support to address the social, emotional, and spiritual needs of children. As migration patterns expand, we see increased pluralism within societies that continues to change the religious and cultural contours of many countries and highlights the need for deeper understandings of religious diversity. Omitting religious or spiritual education within the formal educational curriculum can leave voids that can be exploited by extremism. We can advance by developing a well-being framework, outlining principles to guide a values-based educational system. Relational dimensions are a key aspect of well-being, and spiritual and relational resilience should be strengthened through introducing interfaith curricula, intercultural and interreligious learning, and adopting dialogic approaches to pedagogy. Teachers are mentors and guides, as well as instructors, and their professional and personal well-being also need to be included in education strategies. They also need support in overcoming cultural, religious, and institutional obstacles to inclusion. Horace Mann once referred to schools as the great equalizers. Addressing intersectional and intersectoral opportunities within education will require developing broader educational and multi-sectoral partnerships between governments, NGOs, religious communities, faith-based organizations, schools, and families, as well as the media, corporations, and academia. I'm sure this conference will advance these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your contribution and bringing up important issues regarding the education and also the role as a faith-based organization we do play in this. And here we are almost at the end of our opening session, and I'm warmly welcoming our fourth speaker. Ed comes all the way from Australia. Welcome, Gershon Nimbacher. Gershon is passionate about seeing the vulnerable empowered and seeing people and communities mobilized to end injustice. Gershon is also the author of the Global Education Report. What are the key findings? Let's hear from author himself. Gershon, the room is yours.
Thanks, Maya. It's such a privilege to be here, especially amongst such wonderful speakers and people so interested about engaging in this very critical issue. I could probably spend my 3 or 4 minutes just thanking the speakers that have come before me. Rafat, thank you so much for your discussion around the power of this Adventist-led movement to generate transformation. It's one of the things I'm most excited by when I think about what the Adventist Church could do. Victor, amazing work that you're doing with the European Parliament. 10% of the relaunch budget towards education. That's a phenomenal effort. That's the sort of work that we need to see for a more sustainable, more resilient Europe. And Kristen, thank you for your insights on the value of faith-based education. So to dive into my talk, I thought it'd be great to have a background on, this is where the report opens, on what's been happening in education and how COVID has disrupted that, I guess. So in the last 3 decades leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, the world has experienced an extraordinary period of progress. There's been so much to celebrate on a number of fronts. When it comes to development, and education has absolutely been no exception. So one of my favorite data points in the world is this. So if we get the next slide up, child mortality has plummeted globally in the last 30 years. From 1990 to 2018, I should say, 2019, it fell from 12.5 million children per year to 5.3 million per year. That is something amidst the darkness and the chaos and the pain that we're seeing now should give life expectancy has increased from 64 years to 73 years. GDP per capita has grown by 50%. If we go to the next slide as well, most people don't even realize how much progress we've made on some of the most challenging development issues of our time, but extreme poverty has fallen from 36% to 10%. Huge gains that have happened alongside of and been propelled by the education revolution. So today's high-income countries were the first to recognize the importance of universal education, but the trend went global after World War II. People started recognizing how powerful this was as a driver for development. Government financing and household demand for education just grew rapidly. Most of us on this call will be familiar with the Millennium Development Goals. They were the first set of global goals that expired in 2015. They've since been replaced by the SDGs. And they saw a huge release of global effort for people experiencing poverty. They were all responsible for a lot of the acceleration in the gains that we just talked about. And when we talk about education, since 1990, the amount of out-of-school children has fallen dramatically from 372 million in 1990 to 258 million in 2018. From 1 out of every 4 children globally to 1 out of every 7. So here's one of the most exciting points of progress in the fight to see every child everywhere educated by 2030 that we just don't talk about enough. In that time, we have halved the number of girls that are out of school, and in doing so, eliminated out of school disparity between girls and boys. If you heard that right, the disparity of the amount of girls out of school relative to boys has been completely eliminated. Definitely one of the most amazing steps towards equality the world has ever achieved. And something that makes me really excited about the importance of what we're doing here. So, and on top of that, for many lower income countries, mean years of schooling has increased dramatically. In India and Iran, it has more than doubled. India went from 4.2 years to 9.8 years of average years of schooling. Iran went from 3 years to 6.4 years. It's just fantastic news, right? So that's all the pre-COVID news. And if it was all good news and everything was trekking along those lines, we probably wouldn't need an accelerator like this one. So here's the challenge. Even before COVID, progress for education had begun to stall. So since the end of the MDGs, the amount of out-of-school children has hovered at around 258 million. So since 2015, up until COVID, it's stayed at around that number, 262 million we've heard earlier in the call. It's been stagnant around that number. The number of out-of-school primary children has been stagnant for a decade. So if we go back 2 slides, actually, sorry to jump you around there. yeah, so if you notice the purple line, that's the amount of out of school primary children, and it's just stayed stagnant for almost 10 years. And so in recent years, secondary school students have also stopped entering school at the same rate. So all progress has ground to a halt. And COVID-19, it's not just halting progress, it's reversing it. That's why we need the sort of effort and energy and engagement by faith-based organizations, by governments, by decision makers that we've been talking about today. Some of you may be familiar with these stats, but at the height of the crisis, 1.6 billion learners in 190 countries across every continent on the planet had been impacted. That's 94% of the entire world student population. And in the most vulnerable areas, in lower income countries, it was 99%. So we can jump forward to the slides we're at before now. Most troubling, up to 24 million children risked dropping out of school altogether or missing a full year, an additional full year of education. Unless we act now, to accelerate education progress, things are going to get bad in the fight to see every child everywhere in school, which is why we're here today. So what more can we do? Here are my final couple of points. We need to, if we go to the next slide, here are 4 areas to focus on, and I'll come back to my pet focus area, development finance. We need to advocate for development finance. We need to build more inclusive school systems, which we're going to talk about in the whole next session. We need to improve quality and retention, and then we're going to circle back in this conference. We need to prioritize education in crisis settings. So there are the 4 building blocks to accelerate education, I think, and that's what the report argues. So to finish on the development finance piece, because I think it'll overlap in every other piece we talk about, but I think it is one of the most crucial challenges we face, particularly in light of COVID. So if we go to the next slide, we need to increase aid. So if you're from a rich country, we need to start advocating that donors give more for education finance for lower and lower middle income countries. Aid donors gave just 1/3 of the estimated finance even before the pandemic. So that was 13 billion of the $39.5 billion US that we anticipate was needed. There's going to be a lot more need now. So we need to accelerate how much aid we give to education. There's a whole bunch of ways we need to make sure that that's spent well. And we can talk about that if we've got time. We need to increase domestic finance for education. It needs to go, so countries should be spending between 4 to 6% of their total GDP and or 20% of total government spending on education finance domestically. We need to facilitate remittances, which have all but ground to a halt as a result of COVID. So we need to help them spring back and lower remittance costs. And we need to tackle tax dodging. So we've got better tax bases to finance all this really important work. So that was sorry I spoke so fast. There was a lot to get through and not a lot of time. But that's my super quick overview of what I think we need to do to accelerate education. You can read the report for a lot more detail. Looking forward to being part of the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you, Gershon. I think after we heard all our 4 speakers of the opening session, I think there is no person attending that would not be persuaded how important it is education for our future. So here we move to the next sessions. We have 2 more sessions, main session coming. The floor will be given to 2 ladies. The first session will be facilitated by Catherine Anthony Bordeaux, and she will facilitate discussion about inclusion in education. Catherine is a former teacher, professor, and journalist, and she's currently leading development, education, and I'm Urban Initiative for ADRA in United Kingdom. The second facilitator is Mrs. Deborah Hastings, and she will lead us through emergency in education. She came from corporate and business world to join ADRA in UK, and welcome. So I'm giving the torch to Kathy and Deborah, and I'm thanking from the bottom of my heart to the speakers that gave us such a good overview about the importance of education and even more how to accelerate it.
Maya, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. The session that I'm going to facilitate is called Inclusive Education. And as a former teacher, I would add that inclusive education means so much to different people. In the UK, it often means dealing with behavioural issues. From a humanitarian perspective, it means dealing with all abilities, catering for all genders, and meaning also that education shouldn't discriminate against any Indigenous group or ethnic minority. So what I want you to do very, very quickly for me, because we haven't got that much time in our session this afternoon, is as a policymaker, educator, financier, humanitarian person, or decision maker, state in no more than 3 words your understanding of inclusive education. And what's going to come up now is something called Slido. So you'll take your phone, there will come up a QR code, you'll put your phone over the QR code, and you should be able to type straight into that for those who haven't used it before. So very quickly, and to give an example, my 3 words would be disruptive. Mr. Rifat Kamal referred to that earlier on. Creative and innovative. So just 3 quick words, what you think is, or what you understand as inclusive education. Okay, everybody done that? Thank you so much. Our first speaker is Alexandra Boyag. Oh, sorry. Okay, this is coming up, sorry. You're seeing the words coming up: innovative, equal opportunities, gender sensitive, school open to all. I love this. Thank you. Undocumented, transformative. That's a really, really nice word. I like that. Works for all children, voice, present, listening, sustainable. That's very important, sustainability. Open, radical, for everyone, accessible. Some great words there. So I really like that. Thank you so much. Our first speaker this afternoon is Alexandra Boyagajeva. Apologies if I spelled it, pronounced it wrongly. I've been trying to pronounce it all evening. She is the policy expert from the Regional Corporation Council for Roma Integration. You'll be talking about exclusion versus inclusion in Roma in Europe. Alexandra, the room is yours. Please accept my apologies for not pronouncing your name correctly. Just tell me how your name is pronounced, please.
Thank you. It's Boyagieva. It's a little bit tricky, so I don't even expect people to pronounce it well. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this very important event. Now, I would like to begin with the situation. There is a school classroom, second year grade, elementary school. The teacher comes into the classroom, and after a while, she realizes that her wallet is missing. She gets angry and she takes one child, girl, by the hand. So these are 8, 9-year children. She takes her by the hand, takes her to the toilet, strips her out of her clothes and locks her naked in the toilet to scream. And this is not a scene from a movie. This is a real scene from recent years in our region in Europe that happened to a girl. A boy in another school was beaten severely by the classmates because he was carrying the flag of the country where the school is. And these are examples that happen to Roma children. When I tell these examples to to people, I do a little experiment. I sometimes tell that these things happen to disabled children, and then I get empathic responses. But when I tell that these things happen to Roma children, I don't get the same responses. The empathy towards Roma across Europe is not that high. And the stereotypes and prejudice are deeply rooted, and they're not manifested very often. But in crisis situation, in tense situation, they are expressed, and there are hidden, and they are present in the education. That's why Roma in Europe tend to have very low numbers in completing compulsory even school, and then also higher levels of education. And in many cases, they are discriminated, they are bullied, they are isolated, they are seated in the last benches, they are segregated in regular, even sometimes in special schools for disabled children without any disability. So this is a big challenge. And why it is so big challenge? Because there are 30 million Roma in Europe. They don't have a government to support them. They don't have a state of their own. They are minority everywhere across Europe, the largest minority group without any political support. And they are largely marginalized and excluded. This is a young population, so we have to take into account that more than 3.5 million Roma will be in some 5 to 10 years will be the future big chunk of the workforce in Europe. So we have to pay attention, and we have to take people back to school, but not by forcing them back to schools, but providing schooling environments that are welcoming and that are responsive to their needs. What we can do, there are many things we have tried, and we have been successful to a certain extent to increase the number of Roma children completing primary education, to a certain extent even completing secondary and university education, but we are still far from being successful. We need to do much more. What have been done so far? For example, there is a Roma Education Fund that is providing scholarships. A lot of governments are employing teaching assistants to help Roma connect with the school and with their material. We have governments that are trying to include free of charge Roma children into preschool education, which is very important, as we heard from the opening speeches, that investing in early childhood education is really important. So these are some things that we have been done, and we have increased a little bit, but what has to be tackled in the next period is anti-gypsyism. I'm happy to inform you that with the newest EU framework for Roma inclusion, anti-gypsyism has been finally recognized as the root cause of the exclusion of Roma from all spheres of life, including education, and this will be something that we will work on much more. One good example also that I would like to highlight, and I would like to thank ADRA for that, is I'm involved in this project, Everychild, Everywhere in School, by volunteering in providing assistance to children to do their homework, and I'm very happy to do it. It is very rewarding. It is very good to see that we are helping children that otherwise are very bright and clever, but have not had the same opportunities as the others. So I would like to commend this effort, and I would like to support its continuation. So I know I have very short time and there are a lot of speakers. I will finish here, but I'm here to respond to any questions or enter discussions. Thank you. You have to turn on your...
Please unmute.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you, Alexandra. We will actually have your question in a little while. we're going to go to our next speaker right now. Now, our next speakers are not actually with us in person, but they have actually recorded their messages to us. Our first speaker is journalist Paula Kraten, and our second one is Tamara Raposa, and they will actually be talking about a challenging subject, period poverty and education.
Hi there, this is Paula Krachten from the Netherlands. I'm a journalist, a content specialist, and a founder of Period Magazine, a magazine that's all about menstruation in an English and Dutch edition. This is. When I started the magazine, period poverty was obviously a familiar term for me, because when you want to empower girls and women, menstrual education is a key factor. When girls and women don't have menstrual products and have to deal with menstrual stigmas, chances are they drop out of school, and that's bad for economic chances, of course. I don't have to explain you about this, I guess. But surprisingly, period poverty seemed to be a thing in Western countries too. So what happened? First, we had, of course, rather a scandal, the tampon tax. It turned out that in loads of countries, the tax rate for menstrual products were higher than, for example, for Viagra or condoms or even helicopter maintenance. So all over the world, there were petitions, etc., to change that, and lots of countries have changed their law for this, so and lowered their taxes. So that's a victory. But we have other forms of period poverty too, and that is lack of menstrual products. So all over the world, I've seen really great initiatives that collected funding or menstrual products for schools, for college students, but also, for example, for homeless women. And Plan UK, for example, did a survey back in 2017 that showed that girls in school, 1 in 10 couldn't afford menstrual products. So that's why they dropped classes also. So far for all parts of the world, but how was the Netherlands? Surprisingly, period poverty wasn't a topic here at all, not in the media, nowhere. So I did a little survey on my own, also for my book, Mooi Rood is niet lelijk. So I've called homeless shelters, prisons, food banks, of course, refugee shelters, even scouting groups, because in the United States there were several initiatives where scouting girls baked and sold cookies for to shine a light on the topic of period poverty. The surprising answer here was no, we don't have that here. Was it bad research I did? Probably, yes, because of course we have period poverty in the Netherlands too, because we have low income families here. So where you have lack of money or lack of funding, there must be period poverty too. So of course, obviously, the period poverty is a topic in the Netherlands now too, especially since last year, since Scotland made period products free for everybody who need them. So that was really a game changer worldwide. So in the Netherlands, period poverty is high on the agenda too. Is this a good thing? Yes, of course, obviously, because as long as we have period shame instead of period pride, all awareness, all discussion about menstruation, health aspects, economic aspects are welcome.
You know that 1 out of 10 girls, women in the Netherlands struggle with period poverty. People in Holland who are in debt are trying to get out of debt have 50 to 75 euros a week to spend. Buying sanitary pads or tampons of this small budget is not an option for them. So they look to use old socks, brochures and newspapers. A lack of basic knowledge of how the body works sometimes means that women don't know if there is something wrong. More often they just accept it as a part of their menstrual hassle. And of course there is the shame. Talking about poverty is bad enough. Talking about period poverty means double the shame. If we learn our children at an early age to speak freely about menstrual health, girls and women will sooner seek help if needed. Menstrual products should be available to every woman. The Poverty Fund of the government wants to tackle this problem nationally this year with the help of local aid organizations. They are working on accessible locations to make menstrual products available. There is, however, still another problem. Even though we know period poverty exists, that doesn't mean the shame is any less. Looking at our young girls at schools, if they have no money to spend, it is difficult to fit in. You certainly do not want to let your girlfriends know that you don't have any money to buy tampons or sanitary pads. Due to period poverty and shame, women will cut back on healthy food, miss work or school. Every year I ask my first-year students of social work to discuss various social topics. This to create awareness about what is happening in the Netherlands and in the world. In January, various topics were discussed: poverty, discrimination, Black Lives Matter, addiction. A group of 4 young students chose the subject period poverty. My class went quiet, very quiet. After the presentation, there was initially astonishment. Period poverty? How comes they up with this idea? How is it possible? How can this occur in the Netherlands, in our rich West? Then some start talking, stories of a difficult childhood, poverty, food bank, a lot of shame, and then you hear, we also had no money for sanitary towels or tampons. Everything went to food. Then it went quiet again, very quiet in my class. 16 young students, 16 young professionals. 12 of them had never heard of period poverty. Yes, poverty exists, but for the first time they realized the human suffering behind poverty. It hit them hard. And then the questions came. Why is it not available for free in the Netherlands? Why do we have to pay for it? Why? Why? The 16 students concluded, menstrual articles should be free and available to everyone, regardless of age, sex, origin, just to everyone.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like you to get involved again, because education is also about, not just about us speaking, it's about your involvement. It's about teaching and it's about learning. So we're going to do a poll now. And can we put the poll on the screen on Slido again? And the poll asks a question. Is period poverty an education issue, a moral issue, both or neither? Is period poverty an education issue, a moral issue, both or neither? Okay, and interestingly, so far 91% say that it's both educational and moral issue, and 9%, that's dropped now to 7%, say it's an education issue. So it's 93% say it's both. Oh, it's changing all the time. It's changing. 95% say it's both. 5% say it's an education issue. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Samuel Matamia, who is the Education Project Manager for ADRA Somalia and the Chair of the Education Technical Lab for the ADRA Network. He will address girls' access to education, in particular preventing child marriage and providing safe school environments. Samuel, welcome to the room. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very important conference. Very quickly, I'll request you to move to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we talk a lot about investing in girls' education. Why invest in girls' education? That is the question I'd pose to us today. When we invest in girls' education, it transforms communities, countries, and the entire world. Girls who receive education are less likely to get married at a young age, which is a very big challenge for our context, and are more likely to lead healthy, productive lives. They will also get a chance to earn an income and participate in the decisions that affect them the most and build better futures for themselves and their families. Girls' education will strengthen economies and reduce inequality. It contributes to more stable, resilient societies that give all individuals, including boys and men, very importantly, not just girls, but all individuals, including boys and men, the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Now, very importantly, education for girls is more than just them going to school. I think that is normally the easiest bit for a humanitarian. The most difficult bit, and Gershon touched on it in his presentation, is the retention side, the learning side, and the transition side. It's one thing for the girl to go to school. It's another thing to retain that girl in school. Actually, that is normally the hardest bit for any project dealing with girls' education, retaining a girl in school. Another very hard bit is that girl learning? Because a girl is in school, so you've achieved on the access side, but is that child learning? And very importantly, the child or the girl has to transit to the next level of education. So in addition to access, we need to be looking at the retention side, the learning side, and the transition side. The girl should feel safe in school. They should look forward to coming to school the next day and should be able to complete the cycle of education. And that is why we need to have all these inputs around mentors, around co-curricular activities, all these activities that will make the girl want to come back to school. If we can move to the next slide on investing in girls' education. So what happens when we invest in girls' education? Number one, the lifetime earnings of the girls will dramatically increase. National growth rates are going to rise. Child marriage rates are going to decline. Child mortality rates are going to fall. We'll have a drastic fall in maternal mortality rates as well. And very importantly, child stunting will also drop. So that's the significance of investing in girls' education. So the next slide begs the question. If you can move to the next slide. So why do we have girls out of school? Why do we have girls out of school? There's a lot of evidence that demonstrates how central girls' education is to development. However, a lot of disparities exist in education. Kamal, in his opening remarks, spoke about 262 million children being out of school. A significant number of these are girls. And as you go further up from primary school to lower secondary to upper secondary, the numbers go on increasing. So for us, it's usually very easy to have girls at lower primary. But for it to be considered a success, the girls' numbers as you move up the spectrum to upper secondary have to be increasing. Otherwise, we are not achieving much in terms of access to education for girls. In countries affected by conflict, girls are more than twice likely to be out of schools. The COVID pandemic has also exacerbated the situation. Estimates are now showing that 30% of girls did not go back to school when schools reopened after the pandemic in our context. So it's a big challenge. We will really need to target a lot of girls to go back to school. The situation was bad before the pandemic. It's worse now. If you look at gender parity for girls vis-a-vis boys, it's very low. In simple terms, gender parity, we should all strive for a gender parity of 1. Presently, most countries in our developing contexts are nowhere close to 1. So that's what we all need to be striving towards. So why are girls not in school? Very quickly, I can look at it from 2 points, the demand side and the supply side. At demand level, you'll find that communities do not understand the value of getting a girl educated. And in instances where the girl is allowed to attend school, parents remain completely uninvolved in supporting their children to complete the full course of either primary or secondary school. Psychosocially as well, it's a big challenge, especially in displacement camps. Girls have either undergone trauma or at risk of sexual or physical violence on their way to school. Economically as well, poor parents are not able to send all their children to school. So you will find that girls will be the first to be deprived of an education. Culturally as well, girls are normally assigned a subordinate role in society. You find them marrying young, and they have their own children at a very young age at the expense of getting a basic education. On the supply side, governments lack the capacity to actually deliver high standards of inclusive education. And in instances where they're able to provide this, monitoring its quality and implementing a cohesive gender system is very hard. From an economic viewpoint as well, schools are not able to provide a conducive environment for learning for girls. Most of the time they are overcrowded, they will not have sufficient desks and chairs. Sometimes teachers are inadequate and issues around that. Culturally as well, the curricula that we have in schools do not provide for the needs of girls and boys because they have unique needs, but the curricula does not address those needs. So that is a challenge as well. And that is why you find girls are not in school. If we move to the next slide on gender equality, gender equitable education systems should be set up in such a way that they empower the girls and boys and promote the development of life skills. Very importantly, life skills like communication, like self-management, negotiation, and critical thinking. All these life skills that young people need to succeed. So just ensuring this will close skills gaps that perpetuate all these gaps around gender and build prosperity. Maybe importantly as well, ensuring gender equitable systems in our interventions can contribute to reduction in school-related gender-based violence and harmful practices. I spoke about child marriage and female genital mutilation as well. So we just need to ensure an education free of negative gender norms, and it will have direct impacts for boys as well. Maybe as I move into my last slide, I want to touch on some of the activities that we normally do to promote girls' education. The main one is tackling discriminatory gender norms and harmful practices that deny girls access to school and quality learning. We work with governments to ensure that budgets are gender responsive and that national education plans and policies prioritize gender equality. And the campaign, the advocacy campaign, Every Child, Everywhere in School, one key activity is actually lobbying governments to ensure that the national budget actually has a good allocation for gender activities at school level. We also work a lot with schools and governments to use assessment data to eliminate gender gaps in learning. And then we work a lot to promote social protection measures, particularly cash transfer, to improve girls' transition. Education is considered free, but there is the hidden cost of education, which most of the time caregivers and parents are not able to afford. For example, the cost of uniforms, which are mandatory for a girl to access school. So we work around providing social protection measures like those. A lot of work around teacher training and professional development on gender responsive pedagogy. And then finally, addressing obstacles like re-entry policies for young mothers. A significant chunk of children who are out of school are young mothers. So just having policies in place for these children to come back to school and other relevant policies targeting girls' enrollment. So that is it from my end. Thank you very much again for inviting me to be a part of this conference. Thank you. Back to you, Catherine.
Sam, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. We're rushing on to our next speakers, and they are from Don Bosco. They are Uba Andrade, Roger Mabaya Makadi, and Elaza Arusu. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. You have the room for the next 5 minutes. We can't hear you guys, sorry. Can you unmute yourselves? Andrade, can you unmute yourself, please?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I am Father Lazar Arasu. I work in Palabek refugee settlement for the last 4 years. I was doing other school ministry in the neighboring town of Gulu. Then I happened to come one day to, just out of curiosity, to visit the refugee settlement. Then I began to interact. Then I started frequenting the settlement every week. Then I resigned whatever school work that I was doing in an university and elsewhere. Then I came to settle here. So now here in this settlement, there is a very big need for educational opportunity. So the Don Bosco organization, first we began with 4 nursery schools. After the nursery schools, there was a big need for vocational training. Then currently now we have put up a vocational training. In the last 2 years, we have trained at least 800 young people in various vocational training. Now we continue supporting other primary schools, nursery schools, and we try our best to run this vocational training as best as possible. So 80% of our trainees are refugee community from South Sudan and about 20% from the local community. And it is very pathetic, the needs of food, the security needs, domestic violence, abuse of children. There are a lot of serious problems. So we try our best to care for whatever it is possible. And this is what I can share with you. And we are happy to share our life. We are about 8 missionaries together with Father Uba, you see there, and Father Roger will talk to you. And we are an international community staying right in the middle of settlement and attending to needs of a lot of children and young people. As you see, we are always surrounded by little kids and young people, and we are doing this work. Father Roger will share with you a lot of information about the technical school. And I like to end here, maybe to give more opportunity to my colleagues who will tell you more about the educational sector. And I am very proud to be in this meeting. I learned many things, and we can interact more. Thank you. Sorry, I could not get you in the video.
Thank you very much. Can you please turn your screen on, because we can't, your sound on, you're muted.
I can't get the camera. I don't know why.
Ah.
I hand over to Father Uba.
Father Uba, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Many great things from Palabé, the refugee that in this moment we have 56,000 children and people that coming from Sudan del Sur. We are happy educating them. For us, it's enough that only one child is without education to move us and to do everything possible to offer to them education. Education for us is peace. Education for our children, for the refugees, is peace. Because they don't know what is going on with their parents. They suffer, they're living in a very difficult condition, and we are clear that if we educate them today, tomorrow they will hand over the possibility, their future, that we have a better future. We have to educate them. We have to provide for them what they deserve. They deserve to be free. They deserve to grow happy and joyful. And they already happy. They already nice and great. No, in our school we have around 250 young people, and the children that you saw with me are the children, the mothers that we have, young girls that we have together. They study tailoring, agriculture, mechanic, all kinds of trades because they deserve. They deserve to be educated. They deserve to be in charge of their future. They have run away from South Sudan, and now we have to offer to them the opportunity to grow and to be independent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And our last, Father Roger.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I have been away for some time, but I can try to say something. I hope my brothers maybe have already said. And in our school, I'm the principal, and I'm trying to help our young people to get an opportunity to learn something for their future. And then maybe I've said before, we are Salesians. Most of us are fathers, and we are here since 2017. And now we are a technical school with 220 young people, and most of them, 80%, are South Sudanese and refugees. And also we have many young people from around here in northern Uganda who have been for many years victim of Joseph Kony war situation. So this is almost the situation where we live, and we are trying to help with great support from our network, the network, and also with the help of many people around us.
Thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Don Bosco. We've heard this afternoon about
Thank you too. Thank you too.
We've heard this afternoon from the Roma community. We've heard about period poverty. We've heard about the situation in Uganda. We've heard about young girls out of school. And very central to all of these situations is money. We always need money. And our next speaker, David Archer, who is the Head of Participation and Public Services for Action Aid and Concord, will speak to us about the central challenge of sustainable financing of inclusive education in the light of COVID. David, you have the room for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be with you. Great to hear all of the other inputs as well. I mean, let me get straight to the point. If we're serious about accelerating progress on inclusive education for all, it's all about the financing. We know that the impact of COVID on economies around the world, shrinking GDPs, shrinking tax revenues, means that education budgets are likely to be cut by about $200 billion in the coming year. Different estimates are out there about how to calculate that, but it is very significant, very likely that very serious constraints to education budgets will arise. My greatest worry is that whenever we talk about the financing crisis, the overwhelming focus tends to be on what can we do as an international community in terms of aid or in terms of loans. And I don't want to suggest that that's unimportant. I mean, the Global Partnership for Education is having a replenishment event in a global education site in July and seeking to raise $5 billion from the donor community. And yes, that's important, but it's really is peanuts in the big scheme of things. The big question is, how is that aid money, how is any aid money used to leverage significant progress on domestic financing on education, and we don't spend enough time as an international community talking about what can we do to support and unblock financing at a domestic level. The Education Commission estimated that 97% of financing for education around the world in developing countries needs to come from domestic sources, and yet we pay very little attention to what is it that needs to be done. When we do talk about it, we tend to just talk about the share of the budget. Let's get education to be a bigger share of the national budget, getting to that 20% benchmark, and that is important. Yes, we should have countries reaching 20%. Some countries, fall well below. Nigeria, Pakistan, under 10%. Lots of countries around 16, 17%. Some countries exceed 20%. We should always be looking to maintain or increase the share of the budget for education. But in these times, it's increasingly difficult, particularly when you're competing, for example, with the health sector, who in the context of COVID are also going to make very significant claims for a share of the budget, and every other sector. And one of the problems with focusing just on the share of the budget is we sort of set ourselves in competition with other sectors, when in fact we should be focusing much more on what do we have in common with other public services, because the financing of all public services depends on some core common elements around the size of government revenue overall. And as an education community, if we want to accelerate progress, we need to start getting much more serious about those common issues. And those relate to tax revenue, the state of debt, what's happening with macroeconomic policies, which frame the resources available for national governments to invest in public services. Tax is probably the single most important thing. Countries with a very low tax to GDP ratio are very rarely able to provide universal quality public services on anything, least of all on education. And there is, if countries with low tax to GDP ratio, say at 16%, were able to increase their tax revenue year on year, and the IMF estimate most countries could increase their tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points within a 5-year period, that would lead to a doubling of the revenue that is available to invest in education, in health, in water, in agriculture, in transport, and in all other public services. Expanding the tax to GDP ratio is transformative, needs to be done in a fair and progressive way. There are some significant, simple steps that can be taken. The progress being made about talking about a global minimum corporate tax rate is significant. We need the education community to get engaged in those debates, because that's where the big resources will be mobilized. Countries should have clear, sustained plans to ambitiously increase their tax revenues year on year in the coming years, because that will plug the gap in public finances much more comprehensively than anything else. Of course, debt is also hugely significant. It is madness that you have about 50% of countries now in developing countries who are spending more in debt servicing than they are on education or on health. This has to come to an end. There is a growing recognition of the debt crisis out there, but the present proposals from the G20 fall desperately short. They don't reach enough countries, they don't deal with all creditors, and they don't look at a long enough time frame of debt suspension or cancellation to make a real difference to domestic financing. As an education community, if we want to accelerate progress, let's engage in those debt debates, because that's where we can really add a powerful voice. The third element affecting the size of the budget is macroeconomic policies. The IMF have been giving out tens of billions of dollars in loans around the world, in COVID emergency loans, and in almost every single case, they have been expecting commitments from countries to return to what they call fiscal consolidation within this year. When the IMF talks about fiscal consolidation, we need to hear the word austerity. The IMF has been imposing austerity in countries around the world for about 40 years now. And if we don't use COVID as the turning point to push back against those policies, we are missing a huge opportunity. Now, the single most obvious way in which IMF policies and advice impact on education is that the IMF routinely encourages countries to cut or to freeze the public sector wage bill. Now, it all sounds very technocratic, and it sounds as if our government's employing lots of bureaucrats. but the single largest group of people on the public sector wage bill are teachers. Second largest group are health workers, nurses, doctors. If you have the IMF telling you you've got to squeeze the spending on the public sector wage bill, the effect is to block countries from recruiting more teachers, many of whom face desperate shortages of teachers, and likewise blocking countries from employing more nurses, so that there's no prospect of them reaching the World Health Organization ratios of nurses and doctors to people. If we want to make a breakthrough, if we want to accelerate progress on financing, we need, as an education community, to get serious on those things that impact the size of the budget: tax, debt, austerity, macroeconomic policies. Now, finally, it's all well and good to have a good share of a budget, which is sensitive, of a good sized budget. We have to look at sensitivity of budget allocations focused on equity. What will drive greater equity is the most important determining force for where budgets should be allocated. And even if you have a good share of a good sized budget, which is sensitively allocated, if you don't focus on tracking what happens to that budget in practice, there will be problems, particularly in the most disadvantaged communities. We need to have systematic scrutiny of what's happening with spending in practice. And that is the combination of interventions that would accelerate progress on financing of education. Action on the share, the size, the sensitivity, and the scrutiny of budgets. That's 4 S's in English, doesn't translate very well into other languages, but nevertheless, that's the sort of framework, and we need to focus on what's happening with domestic budgets, use aid where we can to leverage better commitments in domestic financing. So when it comes to the GPE, replenishment, the Global Education Summit happening in July, the biggest moment on education financing for a long time, let's not just think about the $5 billion that donors are committing. Let's look at the commitments made by developing country heads of state and ministers of finance to their own citizens. And let's look at the collective political statement that is going to be mobilized, hopefully predominantly by President Kenyatta and African leaders, calling for action on debt, on special drawing rights, and on other fiscal space issues from the international community, because it's those things that will be most transformative. And that's where we as an education community need to get much more serious than we have been in recent times.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much. David, we literally have 30 seconds before we need to kind of stop, but we need to ask you one question, and that is, what role can civil society and faith groups actually play in making what you've just said a reality? Very, very quickly, 30 seconds.
Very, very important role. I think we all need to come together. We need to make a link between the NGOs and civil society organizations, faith-based organizations who care about education, need to get together with those who care also about health and water. We're not rivals, we work on the same issues. We want quality public services for all. Let's not stop fighting against each other for a greater share of the budget and start working together. Let's link with the feminist movements, with organizations working for women and youth. Let's connect also with tax and fiscal justice organizations. Let's work with the trade unions. We need really broad-based national coalitions in every country that can hold ministries of finance to account and tell ministries of finance that if we don't use COVID as the turning point for financing of public services, we are missing a unique opportunity. This is the year to change those policies, to stop internalizing the dogma and the ideology and the conditions from the IMF, to start charting a different path where public services are part of the solution, not just for responding to COVID, but also for preparing an effective response to the climate crisis. The public sector is the solution, it's not the problem. And for so many years, it's been presented completely flip side and been starved of resources. And I think this is the moment for transformation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers in this section. And we are going to be taking a short break, a kind of 5-minute break, a comfort break now, and we'll be returning here at 3:05. 3:05 in Europe, 2:05 in the UK, and I'm not sure where everybody else is from around the world, but a 5-minute comfort break. Thank you so much.
walking through the valley of the shadows. I let them tell me who I was. I've been talking myself up onto the gallows. Every time I tried to walk away, I couldn't make it through another day. Everything seemed to be an uphill battle. I was trying to make it on my own, my way. You were knocking on the door that I've been looking for. It was right in front of me. I was lost, but now I'm free. And I was blind, but now I see that your love is better than life. Your love is better than life. But I ain't turning back now. It's never so amazed how your love is better than life. I know the truth, and now I'm in a new light. Forever starts today and won't stop now. Your face shining on me, walking in the truth that set me free. It's all I need. If you're ever only for me, then who could stand against? Love is better than life. Your love is better than life. But I ain't turning back now. It's never so amazed how your love is better than life. I wasn't an enemy until you took my place. You were a friend of me, so I could see your face. Yeah, keep fighting the fight of my faith. No, I don't have to be afraid. Forgetting the past, I press on to the prize of the upper call of Jesus Christ. I ain't turning back now. It's never so amazed how you love. Your love. Love is better than life. Your love is better than life. But I ain't turning back now. It's never so amazed how your love is better than life. Doesn't matter what come my way. Doesn't matter what the enemy say.
Yeah, I'm still gonna leave it.
Që nga pandemia e Covidit, s'kam pasur mundësi që të bëj shkollën dhe pastaj unë enda të deportarome dhe fillova pensime se s'kisha mundësi që të bëjsha nga online, s'kisha mundësi që të futesha, s'kisha as kompjuter, as telefon, as gjë. Shpresoj që kjo pjesa e shkollës online, shpresoj të mos më ketë penguar, sepse unë dua që të jem nxënëse mirë dhe
Unë quhem Ester Shira dhe vim nga Shkolla e Mesme e Bashkuar Haxhi Shira Borizane. Dhe sot jam këtu dhe po bëj këtë video që të tregoj vështirësitë që unë kam hasur gjatë periudhës 2019-2021 në mbarvajtjen e procesit mësimor. Atëherë, duhet ta nis me rënien e tërmetit. Kjo gjë shkaktoi prishjen e shkollave tona. Ne mbetëm pa ambiente arsimore. Nuk kishim më vend ku të mësonim. Gjë që na detyroi që të shkonim në vendet e tjera, që e bëri më të vështirë, qoftë që të zhvendoseshim nga shkolla jonë në një shkollë tjetër, të mësoheshim me ambientet, por edhe me redukimin e orareve. Gjë që ishte tepër e vështirë dhe solli me vërtet shumë bëshllëqe, por bëshllëqet tona u thelluan më shumë me ardhin e pandemisë. Ra pandemia dhe të gjithë mbetëm online, por jo të gjithë kishim kushtet që të zhvillonin mësimin online. Dhe kështu që mësimi online mbeti i pa zhvilluar, ose mund të themi shumë pak i realizuar. Më pas, tani, edhe pse jemi në një gjendje pak më të mirë dhe shkojmë nëpër shkolla, sërish, ambientet e shkollës tonë nuk janë rregulluar dhe nuk janë marrë masa që të rregullohen ambientet e shkollës. Ne kemi mbetur pa ambiente shkollore, duke ëndër sa këtej andej dhe duke pasur akoma më shumë vështirësi. Nuk e di se çfarë do bëhet me ne, por bashkëllëqet dhe vështirësitë që kemi hasur kanë qenë të mëdha. Kërkojmë ndihmë dhe duam që të bëhet më e mira për ne, që të jemi një brez si gjithë të tjerë.
Good afternoon and welcome back. Today I will be covering education in emergencies, and education is not a luxury but a necessity. Education in emergencies is more paramount. Emergencies being situations that possess an immediate risk to health, to life, to property, or even the environment. Around the world, all children and families have been affected by all types of disasters and tragedy. Let's consider the volcanic eruption that recently happened in St. Vincent, the continued conflict in Yemen, which has always been prevalent and children continue to be the biggest victims, has left the country in a humanitarian emergency. The explosion in the Beirut port, which has left 300,000 people displaced, and finally the earthquake which struck Albania in 2019. All of these things happen while we are living and experiencing the full effects of COVID-19. The pandemic and the impact thereof has been catastrophic, resulting in close to 2 billion children being out of school. Today, my learned guests will be highlighting how emergencies affect children's education. Not only education, schools offer a range of social services, including health and nutrition, as well as protection and emotional support. When all of this is not made available anymore, our most vulnerable, the children, are greatly disadvantaged. We will hear first from Mohammed Bahashwan, who is the Director of Business Development and Partnership Unit, ADRA Yemen. He will be talking to us about key challenges facing children in accessing schools in Yemen. But before Mohammed speaks to us, there is a question on Slido. And as we have already had the practice, I think now we all know and understand how to use Slido. And the question is, how many challenges can you think of that would prevent children from going to school? How many challenges can you think of that would prevent children from going to school? Your answers are key and we are happy to take them. 10, wow, that's good. We have war, that's also good. 7. Too many, that's also very valid. Yes, there's food, definitely. Multiple, too many. So too many becomes the key answer here. And that is true. And I think Mohammed will elaborate further on this for us. So over to you, Mohammed. Give us some more insight, please.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us here today, and a big thanks also to the ADRA Europe team for organizing this summit. Today, as all of you, I see a lot of you already answered the major question, is how many challenges a child can face if really wanting to access a school safely and adequately. And as many of you know, the world is full of crisis, full of disasters and famine and hunger. But Yemen remains to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis among many others. And for that, we know that children represent a big portion of people suffering because of conflict, because of war. And I'm today going to share with you a small glimpse, a very small glimpse on the challenges a Yemeni child, whether a boy or a girl, would be facing as a result of this conflict. And I will try to share with you also some background to show you how the situation became much more complex than we all anticipated many years ago. Deborah, I would like you to allow me to share my screen if that's okay. Thank you.
That's done now, go ahead.
Thank you. So as many of us know, that Yemen is falling now under a long-term crisis and is recognized as the world's worst humanitarian crisis for the past many years, heading towards the worst famine the world has ever seen in decades. And today, over 20 million people, 2 of every 3 Yemenis, need some form of humanitarian assistance. And as we see the situation in Yemen, we realize that the effects and the situation have become complex as a result of many years. Even before these 4 years of exacerbated war, the challenges continue to add on. And Yemen is now seeing a political instability, ongoing conflict, collapsed economy, damaged infrastructure, suspended public services, human rights violations, disasters and outbreaks, children trafficking and child recruitment, displacement, malnutrition, and natural disasters across the board. And we can see from the timeline of the conflict, and Yemen has always been in some sort of instability since back in the 90s, 80s, and even before that, with great instability happening in the 80s, moving towards a full-blown civil war between the south and north of Yemen. In the 2000s, that continued to be a conflict on tribal and between the tribes and government and other political agencies. And that political instability really worsened in 2011 and then moved into the full coalition war that happened and started in 2015. Now, with that, of course, children suffer the most, and approximately 8.1 million school-age girls and boys need education and emergency support across the country, and 1.5 million children with disabilities and minority groups face severe challenges in accessing education. Over 171,000 teachers need support and remain without salaries or aid until the moment. And a total of 2,500 plus schools are reported to be either destroyed, damaged, or utilized for military purposes and other non-educational purposes. So what makes the response to education needs, in addition to what I just mentioned, very challenging to address in Yemen? And as the Yemeni community, not very different from communities around it in the region, and also some African communities, education is less of a priority during conflict. And life-saving needs are becoming a much more predominant issues to address aside from education, and that can take a lot of focus away from children needs, specific children needs, including education. And that when we speak of other type of needs, we're including a range of different necessities and basic necessities that the Yemeni family is lacking, from water to access to healthcare, food, and nutrition. Children have become primarily a victim of recruitment, of military recruitment. And a lot of children in Yemen, both south and north of Yemen and different regions in the country, are victims of military recruitment at a very early age, as early as 7 and 6 years old. Over 4 million people, many of which are children, had to flee their home as a result of this conflict, seeking safety and refuge in shelters around the country and in other locations due to the ongoing conflict and natural disasters. And many of these families and their children have had to be displaced more than once because of the long-term conflict that we're seeing. Families also prioritize boys' education over girls, and this has been a very predominant cultural issue, as there is always a major concern about girls' safety and concern, and lack of female teachers and gender-sensitive watch facility has also increased that concerns at the local and the community level. And the distance between a lot of these communities and school, even before the current conflict, has always been a challenge for families to accept their daughters to go to school at any age. And in addition to that, girls in Yemen face a very common issue, which is attending to domestic needs, like fetching for water, attending to family domestic chores, and also required to go far places to fetch for water, to do some income generating activities. And that always put these girls at a huge risk to able to maintain access to education, and also at the same time not really having any time, energy, or effort to do anything aside from the day-to-day chores of the household. Yemeni girls are also very frequently victims of early marriage, and this early marriage problem has been in Yemen for many, many decades. And now with the conflict, this adds to the severity of needs for both boys and girls in the community facing early marriage issues. In addition to these challenges, education facilities are almost always damaged in a lot of the conflict-prone areas and require extensive rehabilitation and reconstruction to a minimal level of functionality. And that includes not just classrooms, but also sanitation facility, washrooms, adequate lighting, adequate ventilation. And a lot of these locations where damaged schools are again prone to another outbreak of conflict, prone to airstrikes from the coalition, and so on and so forth. Yemen has always been known for malnutrition being a big issue in the country because of lack to adequate sources of food, lack to adequate health care, and children at early age of school regularly suffer from malnutrition, diseases, and lack of medical attention. And now in the past year and so more than 1 year now, COVID-19 has put a big strain on the education system and put a bigger strain on the health system to actually allow for adequate care for children to go properly and safely to school. So what can be done? And the range of issues is, as you can see, quite complex, but there is a lot as a humanitarian community, as government agencies, we can do to address these issues. And I will only highlight very few for the sake of time. Humanitarian response needs to be much more holistic to address a range of needs as much as possible, because children don't only face a challenge to access a school, but they also face a challenge to have access to food, to water, to nutrition, to healthcare, to a range of protection necessities that do not exist as a result of the conflict. Humanitarian programs need to address the specific child protection need in line with the holistic response, and prevent access these issues prevent access to education. These issues can range from early marriage, child labor, military recruitment, etc., as we mentioned. A focus on increasing awareness of health and hygiene practices and safe practices in school is very important, as enhancing the prevention of infectious diseases and outbreaks becomes more important as a result of the global pandemic, but also improving the environment in schools to allow children and their families to be able to maintain good health and ensure safe access to education. Funding, as we discussed through some of our colleagues in the summit today, is much more scarce than it is in the past. And as the situation continues to worsen, funding is going towards critical life-saving assistance like food, water, etc. And we need to also focus that sustainable funding is important for education and a range of holistic response. Teachers need to be paid very regularly and provided with aid as needed, because a lot of these teachers depend primarily on their one single source of income from schools. Social behavior change and barrier analysis can identify context-specific issues in such complex situations like Yemen. Understanding what prevents children and their families from going to school is important. Peace building efforts, as the situation looks like it's heading towards a more peaceful resolution. Maybe as these talks and negotiations happen, although for many years they did not result in any positives, is still very important to ensure we are building towards peace. So last but not least, all of our responsibility can be to continue our advocacy for children in Yemen and around the world, to access safe education, to increase political involvement for peace building, continue humanitarian funding for emergency and education, ensuring holistic response as much as possible, building knowledge and experience, and also accelerating learning opportunities for children out of school, especially the ones in Yemen. They have been out of school for so many years. So accelerated access to education is important. ADRA has always been active in addressing education needs across the country and has been in Yemen for the past 25 years, addressing needs as needed, thanks to the government and private agency support that we are receiving. We will leave now again back to you, Deborah. Thank you for the extra time. I know I took a little bit extra for any other questions if necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I know there was a lot to be said and that there was a lot to be highlighted. We will now head on over to Frederick Shutiza, who is the Deputy Head of Unit C1 Humanitarian Aid, Thematic Policies, European Commission, talking to us about the European actions and policies for inclusion and equity in education during emergencies. Thank you, Frederick, for your time. You have 5 minutes on the platform. There is already a question on Slido for Mohammed. So I want to give our audience the time to have a Q&A with you guys, because they are keen to hear what you have to say and would like to prick your brains. Thank you very much, Frederick. Oh, before Frederick speaks, here's a question from him for you. In your opinion, what should be done to better support education in humanitarian contexts? This is on Slido. What in your opinion should be done to better support education in humanitarian contexts? Let us see what it says here. So options: providing more funding, create better partnerships, focus, wow. Oh, it's almost all the same. So equal voting for providing more funding, focus on innovative approaches has now overtaken, it changes. Creating, wow. Work on access to education and safety for learners. I will leave it there. That was a 69% vote. Work on access to education and safety. Thank you very much, Frederick. Over to you. Frederick, I think you are on mute.
I have two different mute buttons. I hope it works now. Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you everybody for providing input into the Slido. I liked it most when all the bars were more or less at the same place, because they're all important points. So that was very, very useful. I'll make a few brief points. I know timing is tight, and then I'm happy to engage further in the discussion after that. Just a little bit to zoom in, and thank you to all the presentations before, which gave very, very interesting perspectives, very concrete stories from in the field, and also especially thank you to Mohammed for the very clear picture of the challenges faced in a very concrete crisis, which is Yemen, which links to a number of the points that I would like to make. As I zoom in, so first of all, our EU commitment to education is based on the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we want important quality education for all. And every child has the right to an education. Every child needs an education. This is independent, or should be independent on the context, should be independent of the gender, of the religion, the ethnicity, and the economic or social status that the child is in. I mean, for us, DG ECHO is of course a crisis actor. We want to make sure that education is also a priority in humanitarian crisis. We heard from Yemen how that is sometimes a challenge. I mean, crisis, anything from a disaster to a health emergency to conflict to slow onset crisis. We want to focus, and we have to focus on the most vulnerable children in these different crises. And to do that, we have established both a policy framework in the European Commission, our Education and Emergency Policy Framework, and then a funding target. And I'll come to that in a second. I will not be going into detail. Gershon earlier mentioned the challenge specifically by COVID-19, which not only made education crisis very acute for the most vulnerable, adding a layer of complexity on things that were already very difficult, but it even created a kind of backward movement on a number of the SDGs. So I mean, really years lost in terms of what we had achieved. So this is certainly something that we need to be very aware of, the extra challenge caused by COVID. So the increased challenges for us that we want to address that children face, I mean, we've heard some of them before, is anything from recruitment by armed groups, sexual gender-based violence, child marriage, child labor, and other forms of exploitation. But that is on top of sometimes the actual physical risks. Father Uba mentioned earlier, education is peace. Indeed, just to have children in a safe school environment and not in outside where there's a conflict ongoing, it's an essential element of protection of children, and particularly in many cases, girls. So it's not only a long-term important and essential issue, it can also be a life-saving element that gives a feeling of a normal life back to children, help them cope with the traumas that they've gone through. So we want to very much focus on safe quality education combined with also psychosocial support where relevant, as a kind of tool to break these cycles of vulnerability that many of the children we're talking about are in. So in the short term, we want to minimize disruption. Our aim is to get girls and boys back to learning within 3 months of a crisis. So only 3 months, it's already long, but it's I mean, a target to get people back into school within 3 months. That means not only doing temporary non-formal solutions where there's nothing else possible, but also supporting education services, supporting the formal system that is still in place in many of the countries we work in. But beyond this managing this disruption, I mean, there are the much wider barriers, which are often more acute in conflicts or crisis settings. I mean, that's from destruction of schools to safety issues. Water and sanitation was mentioned before. Sam earlier mentioned the social and cultural constraints, something specifically faced in many cases by children, but not only. The lack of teachers, etc., etc. So there's much wider barriers than just the immediate solutions that we aim to address in our response in emergencies. For us, it's very important to, and for our implementing partners, to design what we want to do together with the beneficiaries and all the beneficiaries in any crisis. It's true that from a donor perspective, often there's a lot of attention to life-saving interventions, but from the beneficiaries, education always comes out as one of the priorities that the communities flag as some of the most important things that are raised by parents and children in all humanitarian contexts as something that needs to be addressed. So I'll be very brief now just on our funding commitment, because funding was mentioned earlier as a big challenge and a big possible important response. I mean, we have committed to dedicate 10% of our humanitarian budget to education in emergencies. That was about 1% in 2015. Now we're at 10%. And we estimate that we've invested more than 600 million euro and benefited over 9.5 million boys and girls in about 60 countries. So as a donor, this has changed our way of doing things. We actively, from the moment we start planning our spending for the year, have this 10% target upfront as something that we try to meet every year. I mean, this is not to say that that's enough. I mean, the needs are always bigger, and we heard that a couple of times. So we also try and work actively on advocacy for others to also increase their spending to education in emergencies. I think I'll stop here. I think I made the key points I wanted to make, but very happy to discuss further. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Frederick. It is indeed, every little bit goes a long way. We can't neglect to say you cannot give so much, but every little bit goes a long way. Now, I'm going to step into a Q&A session, and I'm going to address the question to Mohammed that I've seen from Slido, and I will do two questions as one question, 2 in 1. So the question was, what is the comparison of cost between education versus the cost of arms? So obviously we know where the money is spent, but what is the comparison between the two? And then the next question was, how effective is support in Yemen while the conflict is still happening? Those are the 2 questions addressed to you, Mohammed, from Slido.
Thank you, Deborah. Do you want me to answer this question?
Yes, please. You can answer the questions. We are listening.
Okay. So if I understood the first question correctly, I'm seeing here the most recent on how effective is the support in Yemen while the conflict is still happening. Do you want me to answer this one or the one you asked?
Yes, you can answer that. Thank you.
Now, of course, it's while the conflict is happening, there are a lot of, let's say, challenges or obstacles on the way of allowing children to access education. And from our experience working through this intense conflict the past years, it is important that the efforts are not just focused on one sector. But again, as I mentioned briefly, we need to allow for a holistic response around the child, because when you help a child, you need to help the environment around the child, you need to help the family of that child. As of course, there are other issues, not just the conflict, cultural, that play a big role in the access to education for children. You need to also tap into that area of need to ensure that the families understand how important for children to go to school long term. And again, we need to include peace building efforts while the conflict is in progress, to ensure that even conflicting parties are prioritizing access to education and also not worsening the situation for children as a result of them ignoring the byproduct of this conflict.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Frederick, just quickly, a point to answer. When considering inclusion policies, what difficulties do you encounter when implementing these policies?
Thank you, Deborah. So from our perspective, what we try to do when we design the policies, and then I'll come to the challenges, is of course to look at the needs on the ground and a risk analysis of the crisis where we operate, to set the basis of our priorities. The aim is not to just focus only on the short term, but also together with the beneficiaries think of an approach that helps strengthen the system for the longer term and be more resilient for future crises. Now, I think an important challenge for us as humanitarian actors is that per definition, our response is temporary, and education is not a short-term thing only to be looked at. We should look at the long term. So it is very important and sometimes very difficult in a crisis to work with the national system to make sure that we don't set up anything in parallel, but that we fill the gap and at the same time strengthen the national system in place so that can take over as soon as possible, as soon as the circumstances allow. And I think another challenge we sometimes face is the capacity of partners. We have partners who have a specific humanitarian expertise, but in a specific context of a crisis, education is not the same as in a more stable or a development perspective. So there's sometimes very different kind of capacities needed and short-term capacities needed to set up something in a very challenging context. So, but these are things we're trying to work with our partners to help increase capacity where we can, so that we can deliver as much as possible on what we want to achieve.
Thank you very much. One question has come in, and hopefully at the end of the session, if we have time, we will address the question with Frederick. Now I need to move on, and our next speaker will be Carita Cruz, who is a Senior Thematic Advisor, Right to Quality Education, FCA. She will be covering the developing technical vocational education and training. So now before Carita speaks to us, we're going back to Slido for literally a minute. And I would like you to list the factors that could negatively impact or affect your ability to provide or to access training. What do you think? If you were to be provided with training, what negative effects or what are the negative effects that you have experienced? Negative, anything? No teachers, very good. What about resources? Costs? Secure space? Job opportunities? Excellent, excellent. Lack of knowledge? Hidden cost of training, disconnect with the private sector, cultural constraints. Thank you very much. COVID-19, key factor, because that is what we are covering in regards to emergencies in education. So thank you very much. We will now hear from Carita, who will speak to us about TVET training.
Thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, ADRA, for inviting me today to discuss about the TVET in emergency. And I will try to share my screen with you. I think you can see it now. I will just pass the presentation part of my institution. Finchurch Aid works in 13 countries at the moment, and we work in 3 thematic areas of peace, livelihood, and quality education. And we have 4 pillars in Right to Quality Education program in education in emergencies, linking learning to earning, education sector development, and teacher education. But now when we come to TVET and technical and vocational education, we tend to follow the so-called linking learning to earning model, which means that all the students who complete the TVET training, they would have a place where to go after the training. Whether they start own business, we provide everyone with the how to start own business training, or they will find a wage job with the help of career guidance counselors. But this is not all. There is some requirements we need to face as well. We need a good market assessment beforehand so that we know that in what fields there is work in the first place. All the curricula, they must be updated, because in many countries we have very old curricula in place in TVET. And also the collaboration with authorities and employers and private sector is very, very vital. We cannot do this alone. And we are seeking for results in 3 different levels. For the individual level, so that the youth will have an income after the TVET, so that they can plan for the future and work by their own money. And then we also try to pour skilled workforce to labor market, so that the private sector will have a skilled labor force and they don't have to bring it from elsewhere, from other countries. And that would also then feed to the state level, so that we will have economic growth, sustainable economic growth in the country. So this is the kind of a model we try also to implement in education in emergency contexts. But apart from that, I think what makes it different from, let's say, development context to emergency context is that many times people will have most need for marketable skills. And that many times means informal and non-formal TVET, which is the very short-term training, so that they will rapidly have an access to income, whether they start own business or they find a wage job. It also has an aim of protection, as somebody noted about the security, for example, the school environment, the TVET institution's environment, or how to access what is the transportation, for example. Is it safe for the girls and women as well? Is there a boarding houses in place and so on? Also, the life skills comes very vital here. It's not only about to cover the gaps if the youth has not been able to access to normal education, but also in terms of what are the contents of the TVET curricula, for example, if there is a peace education in place or disaster risk reduction contents in place and psychosocial support as well as contents of curricula. But then when we are looking for the nexus to a development context, if the crisis will take a longer time than we thought, we want to connect this informal or non-formal education to the formal TVET of the country, so that the students would have also the formal certificates so that they would continue to a university, for example, if it's possible in the country. And also it's important to see that this could be alternative activity for counterproductive alignments, for example, military recruitment or race of crime or such things. But most of all, we see this important also from point of view of the youth, that this will give hope for the future, something to plan for, and something to be able to see in a longer run. The challenges we have, as somebody were noted already beforehand, that sometimes the labor market information is not always available or it's not updated. So we don't actually know that in what fields there would be work in that environment. And that is something that also would negatively affect on the provision of effective TVET training. If we continue training people in tailoring, let's say, and there is no work for tailors, so all the resources has gone in vain. Also in many countries, the TVET sector, TVET education sector is very fragmented and less developed than the academic path. So that will also give another barrier. How do we link the students to the formal education if the formal education is not well developed? Another is also that TVET is not too attractive, neither to youth, neither to their families, and there is not so many donors who fund the TVET projects. So this is a big advocacy work also to do. And then the quality of TVET and the challenges, they also vary from context to context. There is no ready-made answers or practices or policies among the actors either. Many NGOs work in silos without cooperation. But the best practices we have identified is also that the collaboration with private sector is very vital. They will feed to the contents of the curricula so that there will be a match between what is taught in TVET institutions and the skills that are required in world of work. We always try to include the on-the-job training or practical training, and we bridge the youth to the labor market. We also have to accept the low thousands because let's face it, TVET is expensive. It is more expensive to compare to academic path or primary school when you deliver school books, for example. For TVET, you would need many different sort of machinery, for example, and proper infrastructure for the students. The groups cannot be very big in TVET. But of course, in return, the return of the education is very good if the youth can support themselves and the families around them. And this will feed to another well-being in the society. And also, I think that accepting the expensive TVET is not only to call for more money, we can also seek for more innovative ways of cooperating with private sector so that they would also cover some part of the costs, for example, inviting the youth to apprenticeship contracts. Collaboration with national authorities is, of course, important from point of view of certification as well, because we must have somebody who has the authorization to deliver the certificates, whether it's the secondary level or Ministry of Education, or, for example, in Uganda, we work with the DIT, the body of the Ministry of Education. So it has to be linked somewhere. What we have succeeded well is the inclusion of people with disabilities, and the gender balance in our project is one of our main aims. In Rwanda, for example, in refugee settlement, we also hire native language assistant teachers so that we can avoid the language barrier with the refugees and the local teaching language. ICT skills are more and more important all the time, and this COVID-19 crisis, for example, has shown that if we have alternatives for contact learning, we will be more resilient to the changes. Career guidance and counseling has been provided also to the students, and we have seen that it's very effective tool in keeping the youth in the schools and also coming to have the access to TVET and also to continue after TVET so that they will not stay at home. And then if we go to recommendations, I think the inclusion is still one of the main obstacles. If there is no laws, for example, in the country that the refugees have a right to access to TVET or other education services. So we need a lot of advocacy work here still. And recognition of prior learning and certificates is very, very important in the context, for example, the Syrian refugees in Jordan, because the Syrians, they tend to have a very good educational background and a lot of work experience. And we don't want these people to start from the zero, as they already have a lot of know-how and the earlier certificates. But the concept of a recognition of prior learning is still in early phase in many countries. We need more multi-actor cooperation. But then to go into somebody mentioned also about the lack of the teachers or the quality of teachers. In very few countries, the TVET teacher training is in place. It's also almost non-existent. And greening TVET or climate response related to TVET is also something that we don't see a lot. We have to pay more attention on TVET sector on this as well. And then the TVET education sector development in general. Because as I said, it's very difficult to link the youth with the formal TVET sector if it is non-existent in the country. Okay, but still we want to go towards this aim that all the youth also has the right to vocational education, which will bring the income and earning to the youth and to the family and support the well-being of the whole society and the private sector as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karita, for your input. It was really insightful. I will now move on to Gershon Nimbalka, our policy expert and author of Global Education Report. He will speak to us about the impact of the pandemic on access to education. Before we move to him, on Slido, we have a poll again. So we are asked to rank each of these factors that affect education in emergencies by order of importance. The factors are food, infrastructure, access to clean drinking water, teachers, and school resources. What are your answers? Food, infrastructure, access to clean drinking water, teachers, as well as school resources. Okay, so first and foremost, the answers are teachers. Water has now taken the lead. Teachers come in second. Food has come in second, and water has taken the lead. So thus far, teachers, food, and water. Those are the three main factors that are taking the lead. Thank you very much for your participation. Over to you, Gershon. You literally have 5 minutes. I think we might not have time for Q&A, but I will send you your questions through Slido.
Thanks, Deborah. I will dive straight into it then. Okay, 5 minutes. There's some stuff that's already been covered, so I'm going to cut some stuff out as we go and see how we go about hitting that 5-minute mark. It's just hit midnight for me too, so I've got to make sure that I stay coherent. I have educations in emergencies. It's one of the most heart-wrenching issue to think about when you think about the stories behind it. Back in the time when we were allowed to travel overseas, I'd spent some time, as many of us have that have worked in development, meeting with the people that are impacted by these crises. I was in Ranchi in India in 2016, and I met a young girl there named Jyoti. And Jyoti was passionate about education. She knew the value it would have on her life to help her escape the grinding poverty that had been so much of her existence and her family's existence before her. It was her pathway out. And then her family had 2 years where the monsoon rains just didn't deliver enough rainfall to their farm. The data says it was 30% below what it should have been, or 30% below what had been predicted and what had been consistently been there. So crops failed, the farm wasn't able to provide. And Jyoti, knowing what was involved, took it upon herself to say, I'm going to go get a job. I will leave school at the age of 14 and go work as a domestic help. Like so many others in her community, she was horribly exploited. She was abused. And she came home, and the amazing thing is, even after all that had happened to her, her response when talking about it was, what would you have me do? Stay and watch as my family starve, or go do something about this? She was knowingly letting go of her education because of this crisis that was completely beyond her control. We've heard already the impacts that were happening in Yemen, in Syria. Many of us would be familiar with the huge impact that had on refugee flows as war engulfed the nation. Millions were displaced. Countless learners and their families were thrown into refugee camps, unable to access school for years. Many still can't. I heard the story of one fairly young mother named Rula, who in just one day of the conflict lost her father, her cousin's daughter who was in her care, and her son. Her son died in her arms as a bullet pierced him while she was trying to flee for freedom. In her words, there was nothing that she could ever say that could ever explain that loss. Whether she lives or dies is the way she put it. She could never explain how that loss impacted her. Life was a mess. The girls were out of school. They had escaped from Syria to Lebanon. They had no education, so she was worried about their future. She was still struggling to deal with the trauma that had happened to her. When she was lucky enough to encounter a faith-based organization, it's connected to a church. They brought her in, they gave her hope, and amazingly, they connected her daughters back to education. They got her daughters into a school or a recognized learning environment. It wasn't quite a school. A lot of it was taking place in church. And the support and care they showed her was transformational. It said for her, she said that was the moment her daughters found hope again and she found hope again. She could dream again of a stable future with a family, being able to earn enough income to get by and learn and progress. It shows me the importance of it is that all the stuff that we've been talking about today needs to be accelerated so we can see people, see students and learners regain access to education. It's crucial. We've gone through lots of different recommendations, and I'll throw a few more into the mix. But some data to begin with. So if we can go to the next slide. Conflict, natural disasters, and as we now all know, disease can hugely disrupt education and learning. Prior to COVID-19, 104 million children aged 4 to 17 years were out of school because of crisis. And when children stopped attending school because of a crisis, there will be many of those that will just never return to learning. They don't only stop the kids from attending school, they often destroy infrastructure. Disasters often destroy infrastructure, disrupt the needs of educational resources and provision, and sadly end the lives of too many educators, making getting back to education even harder. The most shocking thing is that in spite of this, aid to education is only a tiny proportion of the global humanitarian assistance budget. It makes up just 2.7%. This was the 2016 data. Now, the request for increase hasn't been huge. It's been a request to increase it to 4%. And as we've heard, that aid only makes up a small proportion of overall finance to address education. But when it comes to humanitarian issues, aid is often one of the most crucial tools to respond when governments and civil society are just in the country are just overwhelmed. So an increase of 4% would make a huge difference. We've already talked about the impact the pandemic had. One of the other things that has happened is 360 million children are out of school. That means they're not getting access to, they're missing out on school meals. 1.6 billion children out of school, 360 million missing out on school meals. They're also deprived a place of safety, placing them at increased risk of hunger, child stunting, and food insecurity. It's also an incredible safety net for students where they can escape domestic violence at home. They have a safe place to report issues that are going on. We shouldn't, I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quick because I know that we are very, very quickly running out of time. We don't know the full impact of COVID-19 yet, but if the crisis in Ebola is anything to go by, alarm bells should be sounding, particularly for the most vulnerable. The Ebola outbreak in West Africa saw the number of girls out of school almost triple, from 8% to 21%. Immunizations fell by 13%, teen pregnancy spiked, child labor spiked. The pandemic's impact is still unknown, and it will dwarf the Ebola crisis unless we take immediate and urgent action. Teen pregnancies, child labor, trafficking, malnutrition, home-based violence, child marriage, all of these are likely to go up unless we push back the tide. So one clear and immediate priority is that we must prioritize reopening schools. If we can go to the next slide. In many areas around the world, schools have come back online. UNICEF are very kindly monitoring school closures for us, and very helpfully. We still have 10% of all enrolled learners in countries where there is a countrywide closure of school, which is still happening in 28 countries, affecting 174 million students. We need to reopen schools. And one of the most crucial parts of how we do that is make sure where it's appropriate, where infections are running high, we prioritize the vaccination and protection of the teachers so schools can keep going. Now, if we had time, I'd talk a bit more about natural disasters and conflict and the steps that we can take to address those. But we've talked a lot about the impacts of conflict. I'll just finish on, just two notes. One is education can be a powerful protective. So if I can go down a couple of slides, so skip this one, keep going, and again, here we go, one back. Education helps address conflict. A country that has more than 87% of its children in school can decrease the risk of conflict by nearly 75%. It's a massive reduction. So education, on top of being impacted by conflict, if we go the other way and invest in it, it can help reduce the impacts of conflict. So I'm going to go with 4 quick measures that cover a range of crises points. Sorry, we didn't have the time to build the background to these measures, but the 4 key responses: build crisis resilience into long-term planning. So ADRA Fiji have a fantastic project doing this, where they're working with the government, they're doing advocacy, they're constantly facing hurricanes and cyclones that are destroying infrastructure, and they're saying, let's build some multi-purpose centers that allow digital access, pre-place educational resources, and it means that when crisis strikes, when a hurricane hits, there's a safe place for students to go to continue learning, even as the schools are being used as safe houses for the rest of the community. Second thing that we can do is, beyond building crisis resilience into long-term planning, is have a globally supported push for refugee children to be included in national education systems. Some countries around the world are already doing this, but there's more that needs to be done, and some countries simply do not have the resources, so it needs to be supported by global efforts. During times of crisis, donor countries should provide flexible and accelerated funding and have that designated for education. And the fourth step that we can choose to respond with is prioritize reopening schools. I've already talked about this. Where necessary, ensure teachers are prioritized for COVID-19 vaccinations. So those are 4 very high level steps that we think we can prioritize to address education in the middle of a crisis. Okay, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Gershon. I appreciate it. While I still have you quickly, you mentioned the refugee children and educating them. Can I ask what practical ways you can actually educate refugee children, even while they are waiting for their refugee status? Quick.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, the majority of the effort has to be in place in the countries that are the refugees or the asylum seekers, if they're not yet recognized, are in. So a range of countries are willing to accept asylum seekers as part of their education efforts. There's a huge need for more financing. So currently, in 2019, there was a $2.4 billion gap for refugee financing. Only 800 million of that was ever financed. So there's a huge need for more financing in that space that the global community needs to rise to. And the other thing is faith-based organizations have a huge part to play. So that story in Syria that I told, that was facilitated by faith-based organizations going over and above the national provisions for education. So there are certainly things that civil society organizations can do and faith-based organizations can do in that context.
Excellent, thank you. Carita, one last question before you leave us. With regards to your TVET training, is it associated with any academic institutions to provide a form of accreditation for universities and or globally so?
Actually, it depends on the country if there is a system of accreditation at that level. Because, for example, in Finland and I think in most European countries, the accreditations come from secondary TVET institutions, and the academic level does not have anything to do with that. At least in Finland, they are not even, they don't have the authorization to give any certificates on the secondary level TVET. So it depends on the country, what is the system and who is the authorized body to give the certification. And that is one of the key elements also to cooperate with the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Labor, depending on under whose command is the TVET in the country, and then negotiate about the certificates.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate your input. One last question that was addressed to Frederick from Slido. I will answer it on behalf of Frederick, who has already sent me his response. And the question was to Frederick, what are the channels for the 10% commitment? How much can CSO be involved? And Frederick has answered and he says, we operate in a specific framework where we can fund international partners, for example, UN and in European NGOs. Either of Either can, of course, further support local CSOs. So that marks the end of my session. And I would like to say a big thank you for all my participants, my learned guests, for their input, for opening our eyes, and for making us realize the importance of continued education, even amidst emergencies. Right now, I will then hand over to Maya, our host. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Catherine and to Deborah. One thing that we learned from the pandemic is that instead of having a 2 or 3 days conferences, we can do very compact and very good conferences in a shorter amount of time. So thank you for so many good stories, so many of you really provided good insight into why we need to push, why we need to accelerate access to education for all children and youth. Thank you once again. We are at the end of both main sessions, and I'm handing over the Zoom room to my colleague, to João Martins. He's my colleague, and he is Regional Director for ADRA Europe.
Thank you, Maya. I think we have a video. Yes.
Unë quhem Denisa. Përshëndetje, unë quhem Denada. Aktualisht ne studiojmë në shkollën e mesme Selman Daci. Dhe pikërisht për shkak të kushteve të ndryshme apo për shkak të fatkeqësisë natyrore të ndodhur 2 vite më parë në vitin 2019 në vendin tonë që përfshin faktikisht vendin tonë, infrastruktura e shkollës tonë u dëmtua rënd, andaj ajo doli e pabanueshme. Tashmë ne jemi të transferuar tani në një shkollë larg fshatit tonë, në Bupshit, pra në Fushkruj, ku aktualisht zhvillojmë mësimin të alternuar, pra herë online dhe herë në klasë. Por vështirësitë që na ka sjellë ky periudhë janë të mëdha. Qoftë edhe nga ana që ndodhi pra 2 vite më parë për shkak të infrastrukturës apo probleme të tjera me transportin, por tashmë është dhe epidemia e cila po kryen një sër pra probleme të mëdha, sepse të qenurit online, përveç se na shkakton probleme, qofshin ato psikologjike, por edhe në anën shqisore, pra tek syt mund të kemi probleme të ndryshme, por prania në klasë është më efektive, është më e rëndësishme, është më precize, pra në qoftë se ne studiojmë në klasë, është diçka që ne marrim prioritet më shumë, jemi më të prirur drejt mësimeve, të kemi rezultate më të larta, të jemi më të shkëlqyer në arritjet tona dhe të jemi pra për të vazhduar akoma dhe më tej në fakultete të ndryshme drejt drejtimeve të ndryshme të cilat na çon jeta. Por faktikisht ne nuk jemi që nuk mësojmë, ne mësojmë, aktualisht falenderojmë të gjithë mësuesit tanë që kanë kryer një punë të devotshme, pra punojmë çdo ditë me të, çdo ditë mësimi online punojmë me to, ditë që jemi në shkollë sakrifikojmë, shkojmë, mësojmë, për shkak edhe të kushteve të ndryshme që ka faktikisht zona jonë. Por pikërisht ashtu siç e tha dhe motra ime, jemi në një kohë shumë të vështirë, ndërkohë që shumë nxënës nuk kanë mundësi për shkak të internetit apo kushteve të ndryshme që ndodhen në zona të ndryshme për të marrë arsimin online ose mësimin online, por faktikisht kjo llogari ka ndikuar jo vetëm mbi ne, por edhe mbi të gjithë nxënësit kudo që ndodhen. Urojmë se sa më shpejt të kthehemi në bankat e shkollës, sepse kurrë ato nuk do të jenë të zëvendësueshme online, por pikërisht falenderojmë të gjithë mësuesit tanë që po japin kontribute dhe bëjnë të pamundërën, sepse jemi në gjendje shumë të rëndë. Atëherë ju falenderoj për vëmendjen. Mirupafshim.
Unë jam një fëmijë dhe kam shumë nevojë për diçka dhe më mësoni internet i mrena dhe s'kisha as kur të flas, as e gjove, thjesht flinim kësu jashtë, në shiki, ishte gjona. Edhe unë s'kisha mundësi të shkoj as në shkollë, as me një vend, s'kisha as kompjuter, as telefon, as internet që të mësoja dhe mua më dëmtoj libra të tërmeti dhe s'kam.
Po kur ra korona?
Kur ra korona, s'kisha mundësi që të mësoja, që të shkoja në shkollë, nuk kisha mundësi të bëja si gjë dhe si punojme ka shumë kalamet të lagje, ka shumë njerëz.
Po detyrat e shtëpisë ose po mësimet e tjera nuk e pas mundësi fare që ti merre?
Jo.
It's great to have the voices of children, and thank you, ADRA Albania, to send us these 2 videos, and thank you also Don Bosco that were live with the children there in the project. And it was amazing. We are talking about education, and education is about children. So it's perfect to have them. Now, we are in the last session. It's a closing session of this Education and Accelerator Summit. It has been a huge privilege and to be in this exciting afternoon. It was not only good food for thought, but also we got many meaningful inputs in all the questions that we received. So thank you very much to all the participants. So this last session will be divided in two parts. First, we will have a small debriefing from the two facilitators about what were the main conclusions and recommendations from both sessions this afternoon. And after that, we will have the conclusion with two speakers that will come to us and present also some recommendations for the future. So I will hand over now to the facilitator of the first session of this afternoon, Catherine Waldo, and she will present the main recommendations about inclusion in education that we could get from our brilliant speakers this afternoon.
Thank you, João. We've had a really good time this afternoon, and I wanted just to summarize what we discussed this afternoon and also link it to the Global Education Report, which ADRA brought out last year. The SDG 4.5, Sustainable Development Goal 4.5, says that by 2030, they hope to eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including with people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and children in vulnerable situations. Can we have the next slide, please? And the 5 presentations that you heard this morning in the inclusion section, it was the first presentation was the stigma surrounding Roma children, particularly in education. And we heard from Alexandra about that. And it was very sad and very heart-rending to hear the story of the little girl who was stripped down to just to check that she hadn't stolen something. Then we heard from Paula and Tamara, and we heard the statistic that 1 in 10 girls were out of school during the pandemic in developed countries in the Netherlands. And that too was a very shocking statistic, just all because of period poverty. Then Samuel talked to us about girls' education, and he described the lack of gender parity that is there. Then we had a very interesting presentation from the 3 gentlemen from Don Bosco, where we were actually invited into the refugee camp with them, and we saw the children there. And we realized that it was really important in situations like that to have inclusive vocational training. And lastly, David Archer spoke to us, and he spoke about the urgent need for action for debt renegotiation, tax justice, and ending of austerity. And lastly, we'll look at some of the solutions or the recommendations, some of them from this afternoon from our speakers, and some of them from the Global Education Report, which ADRA produced last year. Next slide, please. These particular recommendations from the Accelerator and Global Education Report were that we needed local and global advocacy. We needed to challenge social and cultural norms and behaviours. We needed to commit to equitable international frameworks, improve data gathering, develop more relevant and cultural inclusive policies, increase domestic financial investments while partnering with other sectors such as health, etc., and improve pedagogical practices. I hope this has been a good summary for you of inclusive education within the world to ensure that children who are desperately out of school and who need our help and support get it. Thank you so much.
It was, Catherine. Thank you very much for your summary. It was brilliant. Thank you for that. And I would now hand over to Deborah to present also the summary of the second session about education in emergencies. That is paramount for the time that we are living. you need to mute.
Thank you very much, Joao, for the opportunity. It's been an insightful session, one that touched my heart personally, especially for the young girls in Yemen. But before I babble on, let me focus on what I've written for the sake of time. Education is a priority in all humanitarian crises with a focus on the most vulnerable children. It is and it cannot be stopped nor discontinued due to global crises and emergencies. Every child, everywhere, has a right to education, and with education, a source of income, generational break in poverty, a source of security, employment, a form of entrepreneurship, and a hope for the future. Sustained violent conflict and climate change, natural disasters resulting in emergencies create challenges for advancing education. We heard that today, Mohammed telling us about that most children in Yemen, whether now or in the past, have rarely seen a normal childhood. And he elaborated more on the girls, the young girls, who are forced to actually find a source of living, who are forced to be more domesticated rather than go to school in order to help sustain their families. Sustained violent conflict and climate change and natural disasters resulting in emergencies create challenges for advancing education. This is what our speaker, also Frederick Schuteiser, had said for us today. Our recommendations: we need more spaces where children can go to school and feel safe and dream of a long and happy life. Provide them with the meaningful resources and skills such as TVET, which increases hope and confidence for a meaningful future. This is what Kavita taught us today. If we globally accept and adopt inclusion policies for all children, be it those with disabilities, from the poorest communities, support the inclusion of refugee children in our local education systems, and having access to flexible, accelerated funding, we can make a change. We can create a positive future for the children and help create a new generation of educated young people. We heard that also from Gershon. So I would like to thank all of you for your time, for your knowledge that you've shared with us today. And thank you for making us think again for our children and to push forward in making sure that they are educated even amongst emergencies.
Thank you, Deborah, for this summary. Very insightful, and you could pick up all the important points. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to the facilitation of both sessions. You have been brilliant in both of them. One thing that, well, we can take many lessons, and actually both of you have shared them with us, but I would like to emphasize that one thing was common almost during all the session. It's that we can do some change, but we can only do it if we do it together. In the beginning in the first session, Mr. Negresco shared with us that there is political will for that. And it's good to listen to that from a politician. And that's exactly the same that we will listen now from another politician, another member of the European Parliament. We have this afternoon also with us, not physically. She has recorded the session, Irena Joveva. She is member of the European Parliament, and she has kindly agreed to record the speech for this session. She is member of the CULT committee, the one that is related to culture and education at the European Parliament. And she has a journalism background where she was very passionate about human rights issues. So I would ask for Irena Joveva's speech and for your attention to it.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to speak at this closing event of the Education Accelerator. When I was asked to say some words on the education of post-pandemic times, I immediately said yes, because I'm a member of Committee for Culture and Education, and that's why this topic is really very close to my heart. The pandemic has tremendously hit everyone, especially young people. A year full of adjustments, isolation, changes, and also uncertainty. The only certain thing in this post-pandemic era is probably that most of the things will not be the same anymore. The fact is that last March, in only a matter of weeks, COVID created an extraordinary reality new reality and completely changed the education process as billions of children around the world became homebound. It has been a great shock because educational systems worldwide have been based on the traditional one-size-fits-all approach for at least the last century. Now, due to the pandemic, but combined with the fast-growing digital developments, the educational systems are really undergoing unprecedented changes. Even though educational institutions have been put into an unenviable position with having to make a prompt switch from in-person learning to basically homeschooling online education, arguably the change of educational methods has started long before the pandemic hit. The fast developing digital technology has been preparing for the future as several different AI-related technologies for educational purposes have already been created, and for years the ideas of new transformative approaches have been explored by developers and policymakers. However, we were nowhere near ready to make this transition to the hybrid modes of learning. The pandemic undoubtedly accelerated the transition, highlighting and demonstrating how technology can help transform the methods of how we teach and how we learn. But at the same time, it has also shown us a lot of weakness. As the dependence on IT was exacerbated, it became obvious that social factor became essential. Those students coming from the more unstable and weaker economic and social background were put into the disproportionately worse position. Essentially, the most vulnerable ones, so pupils without sufficient access to the internet and without computers, were hit the hardest. So inequality is of paramount concern to most of the policymakers in the European Union. That's why I genuinely believe we will further activate existent mechanisms such as the EU Child Guarantee to support the children from vulnerable backgrounds and to tackle child poverty in a sustainable and strategic way, thus providing them with equal opportunities. I have read a lot of speculations about the future of education in the post-pandemic era. I agree that the aftermath will probably result in investments in IT skills and STEM education. However, I do not agree with the speculations that education will completely transform to online platforms. I'm certain that some aspects and methods of teaching implemented in the last year will be used, of course, in the future, creating a sort of hybrid way of the educational system. But it cannot replace the human contact and exchange between pupils and teachers, as school also serves as a tool for developing one's character, such as, learning social skills, creating common values and respecting them, making friends also, and most of all, making an independent person. And that cannot, no way, it cannot be achieved through a screen from the comfort of your own home. Having a digital approach in education from an early stage can improve children's readiness for later stages in education and open new horizons to have interactive talks with speakers from around the world, and why not, language classes with students from abroad to grow their intercultural competencies. Education is and will keep on reinventing itself, but the inevitable human contact and social interactions will be kept, while they can be improved or boosted with additional digital options. To do so properly, schools will need the state's support. Even though currently education systems still remain in the member states' competences, I do believe that we will one day create a common European Union educational system, much like we are trying to do now with the upcoming European Health Union, transforming health policies previously also a member state's competence. By creating common policies, we would be able to create a platform for sharing lesson plans and developing mechanisms that encourage collaboration for innovation and development, which would improve the quality of the remote and online educational experience throughout the Union. If another crisis happened, we would be better prepared after the hard-learned lessons from the COVID pandemic. But we also saw that human interaction is inevitable and that we cannot transform our entire world to the screens. The same applies to our educational systems, which need to be made more resilient. Let me conclude with this. The way education systems will actually work in the post-pandemic era, and the future is still undetermined, all we can actually do is to make estimates and assumptions. However, I am fairly certain that it will change, since I sincerely believe that it will change for the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Joveva, to bring us these important points about the post-pandemic situation, how will we live in this new situation after the pandemic. In fact, digitalization and access to technology are paramount for the future of access to education. So thank you very much for bringing that point here. I remember the President of the European Parliament, Mr. Sassoli, mentioning that the access to education, to technology, should be a new human right. So I see that Mrs. Joveva is in line and in tune with this opinion of the President of the Parliament. And we are now in the time of coming to the next speaker of this afternoon. We have the big pleasure of having with us Matthew Siliga. He's the Vice President of ADRA International for Marketing and Development. And he will lead us with some conclusion, with some words that will explain how ADRA, in collaboration with the church, with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is committed to bring every child everywhere in school. Matthew Siliga is originally from New Zealand, and he has a bright mind for marketing and communication strategies and a big heart for equality and social justice. So we feel honored to have Matt with us, as he is the one that is responsible for the ADRA's global advocacy campaign all over the world. And we are looking forward to listen from his words. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. It's a real privilege to be here today and to share with you. But before I start, I am mindful of the time. We're 1 minute to 10:30. Am I to proceed with my original presentation, or would you like me to amend it as we head on?
I think we can finish 10 minutes later. If you can make it short, it would be nice. But yes, we would like to listen to you this afternoon.
Well, thank you. Look, one of the upsides of speaking last is that you get to build on the points of previous presenters, but also one of the downsides is that if you've got such wonderful presenters who steal all your points, what else is there that you can share? And there's been a number of those elements this morning, which is great information in terms of what we're doing and the message that we need to internalize. So this morning, what I want to do is focus a little bit on what we're doing and what we're going to continue to do. But before that, some background. As the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, we've been carrying this burden, and I want to say huge burden. And the burden that we're carrying is probably no different from many of the burdens that many other actors are currently carrying. And the burden is we're just not doing enough. And please understand this. Not cutting it is different from not enough. We are cutting it, but we're just not doing enough. And I'm first to say, look, we do wonderful work and we'll continue to do wonderful work. And right now I can list a number of different education initiatives, from school feeding initiatives to building classrooms, building entire schools, building quality teaching across multiple continents around the globe. But still, when you look at the need and what is required right now, it is just not enough. And the whole purpose of this campaign is, not this campaign, but this meeting today is how do we accelerate education? How do we accelerate education outcomes? And for ADRA, what that means as a global organization is that we need to be more intentional about this area of advocacy. And for ADRA, this means, and this starts with the Adventist Church itself. So together with the Adventist Church, we started this campaign called Everychild, Everywhere in School. And this campaign was launched by our global body. So we launched this with our church leadership. And by church leadership, I'm not just talking about our leadership at headquarters, I'm talking about our leadership across the globe. So we had our church leaders, such as Rafat Kamal, who you heard opening this conference, and leaders like him from across the different continents and regions around the globe. But we also had leaders within our multiple ministries. So education ministries, communication ministries, health ministries, children's ministries, youth ministries, the list goes on and on and on. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to take a whole of church approach to getting every child in school. So in sharing that with you, I just want to quickly, briefly share a little video from the actual launch.
Matthew, this is Ella from Tech. We might need you to click share sound before you launch the video, if there is any background sound we should be hearing.
Sorry, we can't hear the sound?
No, so in your video settings on the top as you're sharing the screen, or now as you click share the screen before you choose your presentation, you have to on the left side that sound.
I've got it. Thank you for that. I'm sorry.
That's all right. And now on the top in your little panel, when you click more, there should be share the sound as well.
Of how far we've each gone in life. We all began.
So does that work?
That's it, perfect.
In the same place as little boys and girls with books and pencils and bright futures. Right now, 262 million children around the globe do not have that. We at ADRA do not accept this.
We have a very important responsibility, and that is, as a global Christian family of Seventh-day Adventists, we must come together to do what we can to see that every child everywhere attends school, completes their education, and has hope for a better tomorrow.
So as you can, as you saw by the video, there was a lot of activity that that brought a lot of people together, and you also saw that people were signing these petitions, and the petitions that we were signing. The reason why the petitions were quite important is because, you know, an advocacy campaign is just that. It's not a statement that you make on behalf of people. It's about telling people that if this is something you truly believe in, then add your voice to it, add your might to it. And that's what we did as an Adventist church. So as leadership, we launched this at the end of 2019. And then through the majority of 2020, we asked our church and the church's spheres of influence, our church's community, to join us and rally behind this message of every child, everywhere in school. And I'm proud to report that after 8 months of campaigning on this, and our goal was 1 million signatures, we got 1.3 million people signed this petition from 240 countries around the globe. And these people, as they signed the petition, what they're actually saying, they were saying three things. They were saying education is critically important. They were saying every child deserves access to education. It is their right. And thirdly, they're saying something's not quite right in my country. And that could be public policy that is limiting access to education, or it could be our policy with regards to foreign assistance. We're not giving enough, or we're not giving in the right areas. Or it could quite simply be social cultural barriers to education. You know, whatever the issue was, the people that signed our petition came together to say, we need to do something about this, and we need some changes in my country, but also in our neighboring countries abroad. So now that we have successfully completed phase 1 of their campaign, and we've rallied 1.3 million people, and we've harnessed their voices, it's now time to raise their voices. So phase 2 of our campaign focuses on 3 key areas, and the first one is really simply to individualize the campaign for each country. Each country is different. Each country has their own unique issue when it comes to education. So we need to individualize that strategy, and in doing so, defining a clear ask or asks. And that was the report that Gershon shared with you earlier. Our global education report helps us to identify some of the key game-changing policies that can be amended in many of the countries that are facing such issues. And just lastly, but not least, we need to increase communication and engagement and alliances, which is what we're doing now. We are increasing engagement. We are facilitating dialogue within the sector, saying, look, we understand education is important. We understand the challenge, but how can we accelerate change? How can we accelerate our impact? And then come together as an alliance. And just closing off today, what I do want to share though is that, look, this campaign, it does look like many other campaigns, right? Because it does. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to deny that. And while this presentation has been brief, this presentation wasn't put together for promotional purposes. You could easily just look at our website and understand what we're doing. This presentation is actually an offer. And this is the offer. For those of you from the sector, let me ask you this. How can we help you? Right? Now let me flip the question. How can you help us? And I am the first to say that there are many things that we do not know. In fact, quite often it's a matter of not knowing what you do not know. So how can we help each other? Second offer is we are all here because we want to accelerate education outcomes. You know, be it from access issues to quality issues in education. That's why we're here. But what can we do together? And Joel quite adequately put this just before my presentation. We need to come together. How can we keep this dialogue going? You know, who is missing from this table? And you know, I say that with a smile because that sounds so 2019. Who is missing from this Zoom room today? Who is missing? Who do we need to speak to? Who do we need to influence so they can do the bidding for us and with us? We need to work together. For those of you from the sector at large, the NGO sector in particular, who are looking at being more, not more substantial, but carrying the burden, the similar burden that I shared earlier. How can we do more? Advocacy. It's an area that I understand when you're starting out, there's probably more questions than answers. And at times it seems as though we're running faster than our capacity and our resources allow, but it is the right way to go. And it is a learning journey as well. So please understand that there are other agencies that have trailblazed this path. And there are also agencies that are actually walking this path and finding their way through it, just like you. So it just means you're in good company. And we're part of that good company. And finally, if I have any friends here from the faith-based sector, I just want to say that do not be afraid to take a church agency approach. And I know that, you know, churches and development agencies that are also of the church, at times we speak totally different languages in terms of how we do our work, how we conduct our daily business. And it's also going to take a level of understanding to understand and map out the structures within the agency and the church, but it's going to be well worth it. The strength that you can harness from a global voice that comes out of the strength of your church is just an opportunity that needs to be taken advantage of. But just one tip, and this is my caution for you: when going for such an approach or joined up approach, please understand this: you're not asking for a partnership. You do not want to corporatize, commercialize, or systematize what this is, right? It's not a partnership, because it's a responsibility. It always has been. It's our social responsibility, it's our moral responsibility, and as a church, it's our Christian responsibility, because that's what we've been called to do. So with that, I say take that courage with you as you join up your churches and take on this great challenge together. Thank you very much, Joel.
Thank you, Matt, for the inspiring words and closing this session. And we have concluded, as we started, mentioning that it's in the faith-based organizations have a crucial role in providing access to education. And thank you for reminding us of that again. This sense of proximity with the communities, with the local communities, give us a lot of comparative advantages that we need to consider. Thank you, Matt, for bringing that on and and telling us about all the strategies behind this campaign and how we can be all together in fighting for this Every Child, Everywhere in School campaign. Well, this is the end of the program of this afternoon. It has been a long but exciting afternoon, so many ideas, so many challenges, but also so much willingness to bring positive change. I really feel inspired at the end of this day. And I have to share with you this personal feeling of inspiration. I felt inspired by the speakers, all of them that were excellent. They brought so many brilliant insights to the table. So in the name of ADRA Europe, I would like to thank you very, very much for the time that you have taken and for sharing your wisdom, your experience with all the audience. I also feel inspired by all the participants. When we started receiving the registrations, we were very happy to see so many people willing to join us this afternoon. Unfortunately, we didn't have that much time for interaction, but we still could get some good questions and suggestions on Sligo. So thank you very much for the ideas that you brought and your knowledge as well. It's perfect to see so many people from so many different time zones. Thank you for being with us. But I also feel myself inspired by the work that all the people that were behind the scenes have prepared for us. The facilitators, I already mentioned them, Catherine and Deborah, thank you very much for your work. It was excellent to have you with us. Visuality, Ella and Damien and all the team, the company that has helped us with the technical aspects of this Zoom meeting. Thank you very much for your professionalism and for your patience as well with us. I would also like to thank ADRA International for the financing of this summit. Thank you to our colleagues there. And finally, a huge thank you to the team of ADRA Europe that organized all the work. Maya is the head of this work. In ADRA, we like to think that we can change the world, and if we can personify this willingness of changing the world in one person, it would be Maya. She really believes on that, and we feel inspired by that. Thank you for that, Maya, and thank you, Jackie and Alzenda, for all the logistical work and everything that you have done to prepare this summit. We will not finish here, and Matt has shared that with us. There's still a long way to go because we still have 260 million children without access to education. I would like to end with some words of António Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He was Prime Minister in Portugal some years ago, from 1995 to 2002. I remember well that time. I'm Portuguese, so it's easy to remember that. And the motto of his government was passion for education. And our country really developed education a lot during those years, and it continued after that. And I think he keeps having this passion for education. When last year in August, he was presenting the briefing for the policy briefing, education during COVID-19 and beyond, he mentioned that as the world faces unsustainable levels of inequality, we need education. Yes, the great equalizer more than ever is education. Education is the great equalizer. We must take bold steps. We must be in action together. We must have coordinated action. We must accelerate access to education. And after this summit, I feel that there is hope, because we have seen political leaders, we have seen practitioners, we have seen teachers, we have seen FBOs, we have seen teachers, everyone saying that it is possible. It's possible to have every child everywhere in school. So thank you very much for your enthusiasm, for your presence, for being with us, and we are all together on this. These sessions were recorded, so they can also be shared in the future if you want. They will also be accessible on Facebook, and we will be preparing a document with the main conclusions of this session that we will also share with you. So we will finish here. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you very much for being with us, and we are all in the same flight, accelerating for these out of school children. We will stop here. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Oh, just let me.
Everyone.
Hi, thanks for this I think it's only the team.
Thank you all. Now we can relieve the stress a little bit. Okay, so we passed the time slightly at the end, but I think